Chapter 27 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 27. Falconer's figure was dropping away beyond the brow of the hill before Anne picked up her bag and cloak from the grass and followed him. In the few seconds that had passed since Jessie had turned his back on her, she had struggled through a little world of thoughts and emotions, asking herself and answering many questions. Like many slightly built and sensitive women, Anne Wetherill had that courage that recovers itself with the swift spring back of an ash bough bent towards the ground. Sheer simplicity of purpose carried her along. Her following of Falconer was not the drifting of some fat, flabby, sentimental thing swept along by a flux of emotion. Her own willpower put her upon the road, and the act was a moral act, the resultant of her pity and her foreknowledge of what might follow. The haze of the early morning had promised heat, white dust, and a glaring highway. The mists were out of the valleys before the cows were milked, nor did the dew glisten long upon the hedgerows and the grass. It was to be a day when flies make the cool gloom of the woodlands unendurable, and when cattle, after sheltering a while under hedges and trees, go galloping round the fields to free themselves from the black swarms about their heads. There was not a cloud in the sky, and no wind moving. The main road, when once it had topped Hawthorn Hill, followed the uplands in one long curve for 15 miles. North-east and south-west the shorn-brown fields and heavy foliaged woods fell away into a vast patchwork of greys and browns and greens. Wheat fields, roots, and clover gave richer shades, and in the distance the northern chalk hills rose like fog-banks into the stately glare of the sky. It was a heavy landscape, dusky and oppressive in spite of the sunlight. The glitter and glamour had passed with the early morning. Anne had not gone 2 furlongs before she had found the space between her and Falconer increasing. He had topped the hill and swung down the slight slope beyond, keeping on the crown of the road and using his stick. Anne had had to bustle herself to keep him from walking right away from her, and this brisk prelude proved to be the measure of the day. Falconer went straight ahead, up Windy Hill, through Dormer Street, a hamlet of 10 straggling houses where the blinds were still down in the front windows, and away along Blackhurst Ridge. Nothing passed for an hour or more, save a swaying milk cart carrying cans to Blackhurst Station. Anne saw that Falconer did not stop for the cart. He drew well to one side of the road and kept striking the grass edge with his stick, and though she walked her fastest, Falconer began to draw away from her on the long rise up the Hampdens corner, for Anne had come 8 miles and the heat began to tell. She'd unbuttoned her blouse at the throat, her shoes and the lower part of her skirt were white with dust, and one heel began to feel the burn of a blister. In half an hour Falconer was out of sight. Even on the long, straight stretch of road along Wanning Ridge, Anne could not get a glimpse of him, and since the smart of her heel became more vehement and the gush of tired tears came into her heart, she sat down on a turf bank under the thin shade of a tattered spruce. Not till her limbs were idle did Anne realise how tired she was. Falconer, in spite of his blindness, had covered 4.5 miles in the hour, and Anne had not spared herself, overtaking him at Hawthorn Hill. She was feeling desperate over it when the steady clump of a horse's hoofs came westwards along the ridge. Anne saw a rough, dun-coloured 2-wheeled cart rolling along at the tail of a brown horse. The cart wheels were very loose on the axle-trees and wobbled perceptibly, and the brown horse went with his head down as though he were half asleep. In the cart sat an old farmer in a white linen hat and jacket, his body following the swayings of the cart. The reins rested slackly on the dashboard rail, and the old brown horse appeared to go as he pleased. Anne went to the side of the road and waited. "Maybe, master, you'll give me a lift." The farmer pulled up with a sleepy start. The fringe of sandy hair round his chin and cheeks looked as though it hung by its 2 ends from the brim of his white hat. "Hello, my dear." "Can you give me a lift?" "Well, I dunno. I'm going Bellhurst way." "So am I, and I'm that tired." The farmer gave a jerk of the chin. Up with you. Old Billy'd rather have you to pull than a calf, and it's a dung heap of a day, all steam and flies." Anne climbed in, the man reaching out a hand to her. The look in her eyes gave him sufficient thanks. He stared down at her with a sleepy and paternal twinkle as the cart went swaying down the dusty road. He was not a talkative mortal, but one of those big ruminant creatures who hang their heads over gates and meditate. Anne felt glad that he didn't ask her any questions. The brown horse covered 5 miles, and the white signpost where the road branched to Belhurst and Flamber stood out on its green strip of grass before Anne caught sight of Jessie Falconer. She had been watching for him at every turn of the road, her heart sinking a little each time she saw the white track empty. Falconer was sitting on the bluff black nose of the Belhurst snowplough, where it lay under the shade of a wayside oak. His sack, coat, and hat lay on the grass at his feet, and he was making a meal of the bread and cheese he had brought from the Fox Farm kitchen. Anne pressed her lips together and stared at the horizon, nor did Falconer lift his head as the cart went by. A swarm of flies had descended on him out of the foliage of the oak tree, and they were pestering him as though he were an ox. They settled on his face and hands and on the bread he was eating, though he kept brushing them aside with blind, irritable gestures. The farmer glanced at him with a drowsy curiosity. "'Tain't reasonable to sit under an oak when one's a-sweatin'," he said. "Flies smellin' out if they have a taste for you." Anne said, "Yes." "Flies be rum insects. They're particular in their way. They don't never wart me, nor fleas either. Dunno why for sure." Anne asked to be set down by the signpost. "I'm going Flamber way," she said. The farmer drew up. "It's a mile or more to Flamber. Keep to the main road." "I can't thank ye enough." "Lor, my dear, don't thank me. It's old Billy as had to draw you." Anne went a few steps down the Flamber road and waited till the brown cart with its white-coated driver had disappeared beyond the hedgerows. Then she turned, and taking to the grass, walked back slowly towards Falconer. She stopped some 10 yards from Jessie, and stood watching him with a flare of pity shining in her eyes, for here was this great, girt man, contemptibly tormented by swarming flies. They settled on the food he was eating, crawled into his eyes and ears, and buzzed pertinaciously about his head, a little cloud of black vibrating specks. Even a single persistent fly can make a philosopher look ridiculous, and Falconer's fatalistic patience had given place to gusts of helpless irritation. He kept brushing at his face and head with petulant, quick gestures, while the black things alighted on his very hands when they ceased to beat the air. Falconer had not heard the rustle of Anne's feet in the grass, but when she moved to the hedge and broke off a piece of bracken, he heard the snapping of the stem and stiffened into immobility, one hand over his eyes. "Who's there?" Anne moved round him, sat down on the snowplough, and began to switch away at the flies. "It's only me, Mr. Jessie." He twisted round, showing a hot, grim face. "Good God, you!" "Won't you come out into the open, Mr. Jessie? It's better in the sun. The flies don't bother one so." His face was towards her, but his hands reached down half furtively for his hat and coat. "I told you to go back." "I can't go back, Mr. Jessie." He felt the breath of the bracken plume waving about his head, and he put up a sudden hand, caught it, and then let it go. "Ah, these damnable flies!" "You want me, Mr. Jessie?" "What do you mean by following me like this?" "You want me." "I? Did I ask you to come? You have confounded amount of assurance." She regarded him with a kind of pitiful serenity. "Mr. Jessie, I don't believe—" "What?" She caught his arm. "What are you doing? Sending me away when I love you better than anything else in the world? No, no, don't push me away. Anne, you want me. I know you want me. Oh, Mr. Jessie, what does anything else matter? It's just you and me, and you're blind. If I give you my eyes, will you throw them away?" He got up, blundered to and fro, then stood with clenched fist, his shoulders bowed, his face tragic. Don't talk that nonsense. I've told you to go back. Do you think I'm going to take you, body and soul, and drown you in a ditch?" She remained white-faced, earnest, obdurately tender. "You look at the black side. Even if it were to be that, I shouldn't care. I know you want me." Jessie turned slowly and stood with the straining and inarticulate air of a man trying to make himself speak in a foreign tongue. "Well, I say I don't want you. Go back." "I can't go back, Mr. Jessie." "You must go back." "I can't." He stood motionless a moment and then groped for his hat and coat. The flies were about him again as he picked up the sack that held his few odd trifles. His stick lay close to the snow-plough, and it took him a little while to find it. Anne watched him. She knew what he was going to do. Jessie struck the grass and made his way to the road. "It's no use your following me any further," he said. She nodded her head. "It's all the use in the world, Mr. Jessie." End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Arnav Darnal. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 28. The glare and heat of the day passed into the cool blue gloom of one of those rare summer evenings when the dew falls heavily and refreshingly upon a jaded world. Dusk came with shades of purple and of grey, dimming the golden haze that lingered in the west. The solitary woods and fields were very still, with the breathless stillness of ecstasy. Strange moist perfume rose out of the grass slopes and hedgerows, and even the dust on the roads smelt fragrant. Trees, hills, and farm buildings became sharp black outlines, as though cut out of black marble. The sky sank into deeper shades of blue and began to throb with stars. Faulkner, slouching along with the thought of a night shelter before him, had been touched by the scent of newly mown hay. By casting to and fro and beating the ground with his stick, he had come upon a rough track leading into a field, and, after climbing the gate, had found the haystack close to the hedge that bounded the road. Moving round it and following the grass wall with his hand, Faulkner had caught the mellow scent of an older stack that had been cut into, but a great part of it left standing. He felt his way to it and found a sheltered corner with loose hay to make a bed. The stacks appeared to stand at some distance from a farm, for, in spite of the stillness of the evening, Faulkner had not heard the sound of voices or the noise of beasts. The place was very solitary, grey fields lying on the high road under the dense blueness of a summer sky. Faulkner settled himself in the angle where the knife had left the brown walls firm and fragrant. He took off his heavy boots, drew his sack onto his knees, and felt in it for the loaf and a bottle of beer that he had bought at a neighbouring village. He had enjoyed many things that day, labours of soul as well as labours of body, and in that silent and solitary place, his weariness threw him into a gloomy reverie. His loneliness seemed to spread through space and to mark him off as a superfluous and trivial thing left on the edge of the dying day. The cool and silent dusk that had refreshed him on the road brought, by degrees, a dreary sense of isolation. The man's heart failed in him a little. He felt far away from the world, and that no one cared. This self-pity was false, and he knew it, and the knowledge of its falseness took the hunger out of his mouth. He sat with the sack drawn across his knees, his face a patch of greyness in the dusk, his head and shoulders bent into a gloom of stooping thought. It had grown dark, and the edge of the full moon was due to rise above the eastern hills, when Faulkner raised his head suddenly and listened. Far off, he had heard the scraping of a shoe upon the road. It had seemed a single solitary sound flung haphazard out of the night, and, for a while, nothing followed to give it certainty. Then the sound was repeated. Footsteps became distinguishable, the irregular, jerky footsteps of one who was very tired. Now and again there was the scraping of leather along the ground, a sound that betrays the clumsy walker the drunkard, or someone utterly fatigued. Faulkner listened. The steps came slowly nearer and faltered by the gate, just as the moon came up as a silver dome. There was the brushing of feet through grass. The gate shook as though someone were climbing it or leaning against the bars. Then, out of the darkness, came a sound that sent a shiver of emotion through Faulkner's body. It was the sound of spasmodic, helpless weeping, the weeping of one whose courage was out and whose heart broke into tears. Faulkner's hands gripped strands of the loose hay. The conviction seized him that he knew who stood weeping by the gate. The tears were the tears of Anne, who loved him, Anne, whom he loved. Jessie heard words come out of his own mouth. They seemed spoken by some other compelling self within him, and against the whole obstinate and renunciatory spirit of the day. "Who's there?" The weeping ceased suddenly, and he heard the gate rattle. If it was Anne, he had betrayed himself, for she would know his voice. He sat breathless, listening. Then he heard a movement nearer the stack. "Mr. Jessie? Anne? Oh, I'm so tired, so tired." Her voice and presence seemed to float down on him like a sweet, sad, weary vapour. Blindly, with a sense of incredulity, he felt her sink beside him on the hay. Jessie shivered. A fatal helplessness possessed him, while out of it cried a strange, inexorable tenderness. "Anne!" She sighed, and he felt something touch his shoulder. "I'm so tired. Don't send me away." End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 29. On the chalk hills north of Guildford town, a man sat under the shade of a yew tree, elbows on knees and chin on hands. Southwards, the landscape fell away into blue-grey distances under the white cloud masses of a summer sky. The slope of the hill where the man sat was dotted with junipers and yews whose shadows fell sharply on the short brownish grass. Beside him lay a rough canvas satchel with shoulder straps, and some of its contents had been spread upon the grass. They included a little tin kettle, a couple of white mugs, a tin of sugar, a small jam pot that held butter, a bottle of milk, 2 plates, and half a loaf of bread. A cloth bag and a basket, a cloak, an umbrella, and an old wooden military water bottle decorated the boughs of the yew. In a beechwood higher up the hill, a girl was gathering dead wood to make a fire. Her feet made a pleasant rustling among the crisp dead leaves as she moved to and fro, humming a song. Sometimes her red mouth indulged itself in a mellow whistling that would have done credit to a boy. She wore no hat, and the pearly brown skin of her neck and hands was good to behold. As for her skirt, it showed her ankles and a neat new pair of stout shoes. When she had gathered an armful of sticks, she passed out of the beechwood into the sunlight, her brown face aglow with something more than health. She went down the slope of the hill towards the man under the yew tree, and her eyes glimmered as she looked at him. He, too, was bareheaded, tawny and brown, with the air of one who had lived in the open. The girl moved very silently over the short downland grass. The man did not hear her, for he remained motionless, sunk in thought, his face turned toward the south. A moment of sadness seemed upon him, the sadness stirred by an unanswered question that haunted him sometimes when he was alone. The attitude of melancholy abstraction appeared natural to the man's figure. He had one of those leonine and slightly drooping heads that look at sorrow afar off from under troubled brows. The girl watched him and smiled. A wise light sparkled in her eyes. She had learnt many things that concern a woman and a man, especially when the man has a vein of dreamy weakness running through his character. But she did not blurt out on him. This is where she was so wise. "Here is the wood. Now for a fire," The man raised his head and stirred himself with the air of one who was not sorry to be roused. "Tea, that's good. I've been thinking." She put the wood down and pulled an old newspaper from the man's pocket. "You go off so, into dreams. It's good to be able to think." He stretched himself. "Grand, sometimes." "Not always?" "Well, no. Some thoughts are like taxes. You can't put 'em off. They turn up regular." She had arranged the paper and was piling up the wood. The glances she threw at the man from time to time were sweet, shrewd, and full of understanding. A match spluttered and the wood began to crackle. "Here, you hold the kettle over it with the stick." "Right, I will." She arranged the kettle and stick for him, letting her hands touch his. He lifted his face to her. "What a mate you are for a man." "Am I? That's what you want, what you always wanted." The expression of questioning thought stole back into his face. "That's it. But there's the beyond that bothers me. You don't know what it means to have always had bad luck." She knelt and looked steadily at him for a moment. Then she smiled. "I can guess at it, but I've broken it for you." "Ah, yes, I have. That's what troubles me. I can't help thinking about it, Nan. Have you broken my bad luck, or is my bad luck going to break you?" She went close, moving on her knees, put an arm round his neck and pulled the lobe of his left ear. "I know which. Don't you go looking ahead for trouble." The kettle rocked ominously on the stick. "Look out, Nan, you'll make me spill the water." "Bo, you great thing." She kissed him and drew her arm away lingeringly. Jessie managed to hold the stick with one hand and caught her wrist with the other. He bent his head and carried her brown hand to a passionate mouth. "I love you just like that, through and through." She gave a soft, thrilling laugh. "Go on doing it and we shan't come to no harm." They sat down side by side to their vagabond tea, Anne cutting thick slices of bread and butter and also managing the kettle, which served as a teapot. She had the air of being confident and happy, and her sweet cheerfulness had a remarkable effect on Jessie. In the years gone by he had forgotten how to laugh and to chuckle. Melancholy had meant the line of least resistance for him. He had had no good friend to pull him up by the coat collar and say, "Cheer up, man, cheer up, why make such a misery of the one life you've got?" But during the weeks that had passed, Anne had been irresistible. Love had made her very happy, plumped out all her being, and brought new sparkles of fun into her eyes. Yet from the very first she had discovered magical insight, and a kind of intuitive knowledge of Jessie's nature. He needed vitality. Anne had felt it, though she might not have been able to fit her feelings with words. Those tired, melancholy moods of his would descend on him like the cold dusk of a dreary evening in spring. He needed self-confidence, sympathy, a little tender teasing, and a vicarious obstinacy that refused to sit down and be crushed by the woe of the world. Anne had said it in her heart from the first. "I will make him happy. We're going to be happy. Let the silly old world say what it pleases." And by reason of the sincerity and the upbubbling spontaneity of her happiness, she had shaken in those few weeks the very foundations of Faulkner's pessimism. Jessie never remembered having heard Anne laugh at Fox Farm. Her laughter had come as a new sound to him, and he was very dependent upon sounds. At first he had felt strangely astonished. He always thought of Anne as a pale-faced, red-lipped, dark-eyed, tragic slip of a woman who had come through a world of suffering and compassion. But this laughter of hers, soft, merry and suggestive, it had filled him with a sense of sweet new intimacy. They could enjoy things together and smile at the less pleasant incidents in this life of the road. Faulkner found that Anne had a quick eye and a demure and stealthy sense of fun. She would describe everything they met upon the road, and her vitality was like sea air, wind in the trees, the smell of a bean field in bloom. "Shall we go down to the town or camp out here?" She was refilling his mug with tea. "I want to be in Guildford tonight." "'Tisn't far by the last signpost." "I expect something's waiting for me there, Nan." Her eyes gave a quick fluttering gleam. "From Ashurst?" He nodded, and was silent a while, his face growing stern and thoughtful. He was thinking of that prearranged meeting of a month ago, that scene that had been half a tragedy, half a farce. Jessie remembered the musty scent of the sitting-room in a village inn, a room into which little sunlight ever came because of a great yew that grew in front of the window. He remembered how Kate, his wife, had come to him there, as it had been arranged between them by letter. They'd talked quietly, almost like friends, till Jessie had refused to carry the conspiracy to the point of savage violence demanded by the law. Kate had started up suddenly, oversetting her chair, and he could still hear her intense, suggestive whisper. "Hit me, you fool! Hit me! Don't you understand?" Then had come the opening of doors, the sound of inquisitive, shocked voices, a sense of stress and of indignation. Jessie remembered how Kate had broken out against him, how the other voices had joined in, and how someone had taken him roughly by the sleeve. "Hit me, you fool! Hit me!" He knew that he had not obeyed that suggestive whisper, but he had thrust at something soft and heard the sound of things falling. This little piece of melodrama had been contrived to serve its turn. Then Jessie had found himself blundering along a road, and Anne had come to him suddenly out of the darkness. She had taken his hand, and they'd gone away in silence, neither of them venturing to speak of what had passed. Yet all this seemed to have happened long ago, as they dreamed together over the Surrey hills, living a happy vagabond life, sleeping in barns and under haystacks, and watching the stars and the moon at night. The life cost them little in the matter of hard cash, and Falconer had enough money on him to last a couple of years as things went. The heat of the day had passed when they picked up their baggage and tramped downhill to Guildford. This red, happy, lovable old town opens its heart pleasantly to those who travel and tarry upon the way. Anne and Jessie descended the steep main street with its mellow and pleasant houses, its outjutting clock, its green glimpse of the hill beyond the river. Jessie felt the stones under his feet and heard the stir of life about him. Anne led him by the hand, and the idly curious turned to stare after this vagabond, brown-faced couple, the man blind with a pack strapped to his shoulders, and the girl, neat and comely, leading him by the hand. From the yard entry of the Angel Hotel, a cheeky, snub-nosed youngster bobbed out with a grin and a quip. "Hello, Samson! There's air!" And Falconer smiled, which showed that he was learning much. They crossed the bridge over the river, and in a side street somewhere beyond it, Anne stopped before a stiff, straight-up-and-down old red house that posted a big bracket lamp over its front door. On the lamp, in red letters, were the words, "The Tennyson Temperance Hotel." This was not the first time that Anne and Jessie had come through Guildford town, and clean shirts and decent food were to be had in the red brick house. Moreover, picturesque people were not stared at dubiously by the fat woman who managed the establishment, and though her house was a temperance house, she had few prejudices. All sorts of men and women tarried there and passed on, shop assistants out on a cycle tour, travelling mountebanks, artisans, some of the lesser fry among commercial travellers. One had but to glance at the greasy visitors' book in the coffee-room to get a glimpse of vulgar, cheery, bounding life. There was something sordid about the gaiety of these people. It was all so cheap, so coarsely sentimental. It made one appreciate the mute look of an animal, the dignity of a dog. The entries were full of titters, giggles, stupid innuendos. One saw the shop bag in every line, the cheap spirit of a cheap age, the abominable folly of a little education. Sometimes we're compelled to recognise the necessity of scorn. The fat woman smiled at Anne and Falconer. She smiled at everybody and was never at a loss for a name. "Oh, yes, I can give you a room. Lovely weather, ain't it? There's a letter been waiting for you, Mr. Falconer. It's been here 2 days. She went smoothly and largely into a little side room and returned with the letter. My, you do look brown, both of you. For myself, I shan't mind when autumn comes. I ain't so slim as I used to be, and the kitchen fire in the summer heat fair make me sizzle. Their room at the Tennyson Temperance Hotel was a little back room, looking out on a sort of mixed yard and garden. There was a fowl house in one corner and a rough woodshed in another. Numberless queer, irregular, red-tiled roofs sloped hither and thither, and nasturtiums climbed wherever a piece of paling was to be found. In the backyard a boy was whistling and cleaning boots, his head within 6 inches of a row of stockings that had been hung out on a line to dry. Jessie could see nothing of all this, but Anne threw up the window and looked out, and appeared perfectly happy and at home. Things interested her, and she had no craving for smart and flashy surroundings. She helped Jessie off with his pack and put sundry articles away into a yellow-grained chest of drawers. The fat woman's voice came up the stairs. Now, what would you like to eat, my dear? Tea and cold meat, now or presently? Anne glanced at Jessie. I'm not hungry yet. No, let's go out for a while. I've got this letter to read. Anne leant over the banisters and explained their desires, and the fat woman said, Right-o! A man who is truly wise might well exclaim, I thank fate that my birth was postponed until the land had been filled with old houses, memories and ruins. To be modern is to be old, for we moderns have the treasure chests and the books of the ages ready to our hands. It is we who are ancient, complex, classic, those few of us who are not ragmen and politicians. Much of the world is ripe for the lover of poetry. New stone and raw brick may have been as ugly in their youth as the stuff the barbarian builds within unmentionable suburbs. Our inheritance has been the mellow colouring, the silver and gold of lichenous surfaces, the black oak, the worn ways. Moreover, we moderns have many moods. We desire variety, a quick change of programme, and the world has come to that degree of complexity where it can provide us with swift and vivid contrasts, and it is better so. Your true and selfish artist does not desire the millennium. Slums and sorrow and starvation would be a vast loss to the piquancy of life. At present everything is to hand. You walk out of a cathedral into a public house and turn from a paragraph on Ruskin to the account of the latest murder. In a town such as Guildford, you have 6 centuries at your elbow, and mountebanks and singers and barrel organs to make a gay stir at night. Falconer and Anne Wetherell, passing out under the bracket lamp of the Tennyson Temperance Hotel, crossed Elaine's River in a few seconds, and in a minute more were within the burial ground of St. Mary's Church. A sweet, sad, sacred, and diminutive place, this burial ground, in the red heart of the old town. Sacred and sweet, too, the queer church with its floor at 3 different levels. Anne and Jessie, desiring to be alone, could have found no better place than this ancient church. The door was unlocked, the interior empty, silent and streaked with sunlight. The hush was like a cool hand to a hot forehead. Anne and Jessie found a seat in a faraway corner, and Falconer gave her Kate Falconer's letter. Read it to me. Is there anything enclosed? She opened it and found a piece of coloured paper folded up within the letter. Here's one of those things they take at banks. A cheque. What's on it? £500. Well, that's what I expected. Anne looked awed. Does this little bit of paper mean? It means that I could change it for 500 golden sovereigns. Read the letter. She read it to him in a soft, slow voice, her brows slightly knitted as though the mere deciphering of the words was not the only effort that it caused her. The old, sad, discordant life became audible, like the din of traffic heard in the quiet church. She felt for one of Jessie's hands as she read, and held it firmly. Yet there was hope in this letter, a suggestion of a sharp and truthful disentangling of knots, a cutting asunder of absurd bonds. It was a document of liberty for 4 people, a promise of cleaner and sincerer lives. They were silent a while. Then Jessie said, "She's a woman of her word. I always knew she had courage. She has treated me very fairly." Anne sighed contentedly. "Isn't it worlds better? Folk are so funny. They all seem so afraid of each other and just make believe so that the others shan't get talking. I'd rather have my house clean and empty than dirty under the carpets and full of folk I didn't like." Jessie sat for some moments in a reverie. "It's the crowd," he said. "One is expected to go with the crowd or suffer." Next morning, the manager of one of the local banks had 2 picturesque customers who smelt of the open road passed on to him by an amused clerk. A blind man desired to open an account with the bank, place £400 on deposit and £120 as a current account. He presented a cheque for £500 and £20 in gold. The blind man had a girl with him, and the bank manager took them both into his private room. He was a discreet person and had accumulated experience. The cut of the coat did not always mark the man of means. The proprietor of an itinerant steam roundabout, coconut shies and swings, paid his miscellaneous takings into this particular bank, and the manager knew that the figures ran into several hundreds yearly. He asked a few questions and went through certain formalities. "I suppose the cheque is all right. You know the drawer?" "Pretty well," said Jessie. "I shall stay in Guildford till that cheque is honoured." Nor had he to wait long. Kate Falconer was a woman of her word. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 30. The September and October of that year were phenomenally dry and fine. The wind swinging between northeast and northwest, and the days beginning greyly with dense mists and heavy dews. By 7 o'clock blue sky would be showing, with the sun breaking through into a world of strangeness and mystery. Tall bronzed oaks and glimmering firs glittered above wreaths of silver fogs. Great waves of vapour went dragging across the hills, trailing ragged edges away from the golden grasp of the sun. These mornings became peerless days, days of purple horizons and majestic skies, and as the autumn mellowed, the earth and sky became a study in blue and bronze. To Falconer and Anne, these weeks were the happiest weeks that either of them had ever lived. Out of the red town and along the Hog's Back ran the open road, with blue hills touching the horizon and a sense of wonder in the air. All ways were open to these two, and no such thing as haste existed. In Guildford, Falconer had bought a couple of camping sheets and light blankets, which he carried in a roll under his pack. For 10 nights together they did not sleep under a roof, but found some spot under a beech tree or yew where the dew did not penetrate and the ground was dry. Often they would gather leaves to make a bed, and build a shelter of boughs when there was a wind. It was a primitive life, spacious and pleasant so long as the fine weather held. From Farnham they went by way of Alton, and on over the hills to Winchester, descending by a steep and winding street into the heart of the old town. It was a Saturday morning, and the narrow ways were crowded with carts, motors, and carriages. Anne, leading Jessie along the pavement, was conscious of impatient hurrying glances, rude stares, and curious smiles. Falconer was too big for the Winchester pavements, and since Anne had to walk beside him, other people were compelled to stand aside against shop windows or step into the roadway. It is an impatient age, and even such a town as Winchester catches the fever of the day. The rattle of the traffic and the blare of motor horns filled Falconer's dark world with clamour and unrest. "Get on, get on!" said the voice of this provincial city, and Jessie felt himself in the way. Modern he might be in some of his methods of thought, but in the main he was part of the old English country life. Slow, sagacious, steadfast, hating hurry. "Turn out of this, Nan." She found a passageway that led into a great green space, the close of the cathedral. The petty commercial eagerness of the street changed to stateliness and beautiful indifference, for the grey cathedral was as indifferent as nature. Man brushed about its buttresses, imagined God hidden somewhere in the intricacies of its lights and shadows, and dowered it with all manner of complex hopes and emotions, but the silent stones did not heed the patter of passing feet. Jessie felt Anne's hand tighten upon his arm. "It's wonderful. You've seen it before, perhaps?" "Years ago." "Let's go in. There won't be people in a hurry to buy butter and eggs and bacon." Anne had never been in any building bigger than Ashurst Church, and here her crude, innocent, sweet soul fluttered like a lost bird through the immensities of the place. She gazed and wondered and felt of no account. The cathedral awed her by its very silence. She did not hear one of its many wistful, whispering voices, and to her its memories did not exist. She knew nothing of styles, of the shadow bands made by mouldings, of the difference between axe and chisel work, of the nature of old glass. To Anne, it was a great, oppressive, incomprehensible place in which her ignorance crept like a mouse hunting for crumbs. Jessie stood bareheaded, stooping slightly as though listening to music. The cool, sad silence of such a place drowned in him the thought of self. He became a part of other lives, other emotions, other doubts. With Anne it was different. She could not give herself to this great grey grove of stone. It awed her, but without touching her sympathies. Jessie, whose hand held hers, felt a kind of striving of her consciousness against the vastness of the building and the inadequacy of her own impressions. "Big, isn't it?" "It's too big. It swallows one up. And how do they keep it warm in the winter?" Jessie smiled. This was the human Annie knew. No affectations of wonder and admiration. "Oh, furnaces. Does the place make you feel cold?" She was frank. "It makes me feel small and wretched, and that we little folks don't matter. Let's go back into the sun." It was Winchester City that gave the first rebuff to the complete joyousness of this vagabond life. The incident was trivial enough, but taken together with other impressions it left a sore point in Anne's mind. The trouble arose over the need of a lodging for the night, and the originator of the offence was a stout, dumpy young person in black, with bare forearms, a big bosom, and a golden head that shone reflected in the mirrors of a certain Winchester inn. Anne had hesitated under the great gilded signboard, but Falconer was in the mood for calling his money as good as anyone else's, so Anne confronted the golden-haired young woman, who looked at her with lethargic pertness from an enclosure that was half office and half bar. The woman had one of those placidly insolent, flat faces that betray no emotion. She stared at Falconer and Anne, resumed the scribbling of a letter, and then stared again as though it was no business of hers to put an end to the silence. Anne noticed that the girl had a double chin, hard eyes, and broad nostrils. The eyes seemed to grow harder and more staring when she asked for a room for the night. "Sorry, can't take you." Anne flushed. As a woman, she felt very keenly what the other woman did not trouble to conceal. Are you sure? The flat, white face under the intricate mass of golden hair remained insolently casual. Sorry, we haven't a room. It was the moment for Falconer to be inopportunely blind. You might be able to manage something. The young woman caught him up. I think I said we haven't room. Jessie felt Anne's hand on his arm. She said something in a low voice and led him out into the street. Falconer was doubly blind. He'd seen nothing and divined nothing, not even from the yellow-headed woman's voice. There was no room for them in the inn, that was all, and they would have to go elsewhere. But Anne's face had a red blur on either cheek, and she avoided the eyes of the people who stared at her in the street. She had seen the other woman's eyes look her over, glance at her hands, and remain hard. A woman is quick at divining what another woman is thinking and saying behind the screen of her silence. Anne knew that she and Jessie had been turned away as undesirables, and that the woman with the flat white face had not troubled to cover her contempt. To be treated with suspicion by sordid people is to come very near to feeling sordid, and Anne's face burnt. Falconer guessed nothing of all this. He had grown so much happier of late that he had lost some of his cleverness for catching the gloomier means and motives of life. When a man is happy, he is apt to grow stolid and unobservant. To feel and appreciate the finer vibrations of life, it is necessary to be a little sad. Try somewhere else, Nan. She concealed her humiliation from him. I want to be somewhere quiet, Jessie. I don't like these flash places. Was it flash? Oh, then try something simpler. Winchester gave them a little back bedroom for the night, in a cottage that was one of a row. The old woman who kept a card in her window with furnished room to let thereon was sly, cynical, and servile. She called Anne, "My dear," slunk restlessly about the house like a lean cat, and filled the place with the smell of greens that she cooked in the kitchen. Anne had been bred to a rough life, but the old woman and her cottage inspired in her a nameless and instinctive disgust. They left next morning and tramped off through the autumn sunlight on the Romsey Road. Jessie was in good spirits, but Anne inclined towards silence. She answered Falconer with few words, and her pale face with its dark eyes seemed to move through a mist of thought. Anne had had one of those flashes of foreknowledge that come to one in life, and she was no longer ready to laugh carelessly over the vicissitudes of tramping. She had struck her foot against the flint of reality, and the pain had set her thinking. This life that they were leading had taken on a new significance. It was no longer a thing of perfect glamour, a path that went no one troubled whither, so long as it sought the sunset. Other facts persisted in crowding upon Anne's consciousness, such facts as the ways and means of life, bad weather and sickness. It struck her that life could not always be like this, and she was amazed at not having realized the truth before. Visions of a drenched landscape, muddy roads, hurrying skies rose before her. Then how long would that money of Jessie's last? If either of them fell ill, there would be no place that they could call home. People might turn them away, as the yellow-haired woman had done. The thought rankled. Later, she had a mind picture of a little red cottage, set well back in a garden, with a yew tree shading the porch and the brick-paved path. There would be a snug kitchen, within where one could draw up close to the fire and sit with one's feet on the fender. The wind would rattle the lattices and roar in the chimneys, but that would not matter. And work? Anne felt a kind of sudden homesickness for work, a desire to use her hands, to bustle, to contrive, to clean and polish. How good it would be to do it all for Jessie. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 31. It was mid-October when they came to the forest, but the days were dry and sunny, and the nights none too cold. Anne had recovered her happy mood, and the reflections that the yellow-haired woman had roused became faint shadows that escaped notice. Moreover, the forest is a wizard's wilderness, casting a spell upon all those who have some of the wild blood left in their hearts. Primitively beautiful and strange, its very silence stands and calls from the infinitudes of its whispering gloom. Glades and open spaces dance with the sunlight. There are 100 stillnesses, 100 noises, the stillness of midnight, the hush of the dawn, the down-fluttering of leaves, dead wood breaking, the drip of rain, all manner of strange murmurings, bird notes, storm cries, the snorting of ponies, the tinkling of cowbells. Mystery! Everything is mysterious with the mystery of unsolved silences and unseen depths. The old hollies shake black robes and mutter spells. The bracken hides secret lovers. Between the great trunks of the beeches and under their gorgeous colours, wild men in skins chase laughing girls. Firwoods sigh and muse and break into rhapsodies. Sunlight and shadow tangle each other. Streams wander where they will. Bog flowers and vivid mosses blaze in the moist places. Across the open spaces you should see forest knights go riding in green-painted armour with great ladies in gold samite. Who should tell of the blackness of the night, the redness of the sunset, the purple of the heather, the green glimmer of leaves, the many fragrances, the rush of rain in June? One knows by instinct that many strange things have happened in the forest. The forest knows it also. Memories rustle like autumn leaves. Though Falconer was blind, the spell of the place smote him, and stirred in him many emotions. Anne would tell him that the oaks and beeches were changing colour, and Jessie saw them with their incipient reds and golds. Poplars were a glitter of gold, the heather rusty, the bracken shades of saffron and of bronze. The smell of autumn was in the bosom of summer. Leaves rustled and fell. There were wayward gusts of wind that danced along the sandy roads. At such a season, and in such a place, a woman's mouth may draw many kisses, and these two became primitive folk, couching amid the bracken, and catching each other with passionate hands. At night they lay close together under some yew or holly, and felt the vast silence of the moist autumn darkness. Every sense seemed quickened, even Falconer's faculty for seeing things from within. He was in miraculous touch with his surroundings, and would point and say, "Look at the bracken yonder," and the bracken would be there, in tawny waves. The forest absorbed all their vitality and yet quickened it. It demanded the whole consciousness and would not let the imagination look beyond its borders. A day in the forest was nothing but a day. It was the one day of all days. Neither the past nor the future had ever existed. Moreover, Falconer and Anne struck up sundry quaint and passing friendships upon the forest roads. Tramping from Lyndhurst towards Lymington, they fell in with a battered old vagabond whose toes showed through his boots. He had a red squab of a face, a pudgy nose, a scattering of babyish curls under his felt hat, and a long mouth that writhed and twisted under the touch of an irrepressible sense of fun. He passed Anne and Falconer, who were sitting on a grass bank, turned, took a stumpy clay pipe from between his teeth, and saluted him. "Salve, Villiamere! Arma virumque cano! What price the weather?" He sat down on the bank, introduced himself, and proceeded to make friends. There was a genial lilt about his flow of soul, and his eyes were full of twinkles. People passed by, people in motors, people in traps, people on bicycles, people afoot. The tramp eyed them all with quizzical interest and had something pithy to say of each. "Know the tale of the two skunks, eh? No? What's the use, when the motor's past? Smell. See? Ah, good morning, Lord Ballyshannon. Oily Irish scoundrel, that in the flash dog cart. Do you know how to be generous when you're Irish? No? Well, borrow a shilling and then give it away as the last bit of silver you've got in the world. Sensation! Splendid fella!" They all laughed, and Jessie and the tramp began to talk, though the tramp did most of the talking. "Name! My name! What do you want to label me for? Call it Ulysses II. What? No adventures in these days? No one-eyed giants and no calypsos? Oh, bosh! Life's full of adventures. A flea's an adventure, a mighty hunting, the scratching of the bites, ecstasy. No, being kicked out of a barn's an adventure, being given a bath's an adventure. What? There's an old screw-face in that carriage, nettlefold all over." He took off his disgraceful hat to the high-nosed, clay-coloured woman in a Victoria. Her stare of surprise seemed to amuse the tramp. "What a rum world! Supposing I was God Almighty in a pair of patched trousers and a seedy shirt, wouldn't she have caught it? Dirty vagabond! Oh, lor!" He chuckled and nodded his head. As for his vocabulary, it was original and voluminous. Some day in the past he must have worn starched shirts and belonged to a solid and self-conscious society. Now he sat on a grass bank, twitted the people who went by, and tagged wonderful titles to them. Two fat women and a very thin man in a cart he hailed as 881. That was a great joke. He had to explain it to Jessie. "They added up well, eh? 881. There must be bad luck in numbers. That thin chap'll find himself squeezed into a fraction." A lean cleric who cycled by with head and ear and pince-nez perched on the bridge of a ritualistic nose was christened the Rev Slimy Wafer upon Wheels. A red-faced commercial traveller driving round in a wagonette drew sardonic scorn. "Boiled beef! Vulgar stuff! Beg pardon, what were we saying? That Browning might just as well have been called blacking. To hello with Sordallo! Poets, I can crack the lot. Of all the bacchanalian bosh. You don't grasp the cleverness of that, Miss Black Eyes. Yes, I'm a genius. Look at my boots. I'll say this to you. Keep healthy, keep laughing. Don't overfeed and don't drink too much like me. Then you won't want to have to read good books." He accompanied them towards Lymington, walking with a sore-footed shuffle, but displaying immense cheerfulness and a vivid sense of humour. He appeared to be about the freest person on earth. No affectations of superiority on the part of society could abash him. He looked at the respectable world in the face and laughed uproariously. When they'd gone a mile or so, Anne saw him scuffle down suddenly into a ditch. He returned triumphantly with a pair of discarded boots. Dreary objects that they were, they appeared to be 1 degree less dilapidated than his own. "Well, boss, I guess my bare toes would tickle a respectable town to death." He sat down on the edge of the road, stripped off his own boots, transferred the bits of string that served as laces, and shot himself anew. "Dinky, ain't they? The chap who threw these beauties away was a fool or a bloated plurocrat. I guess these old servants won't find a new master. Booties, my dears, you shan't die in a ditch. You shall be covered up by nice brown leaves." And he shied them into a wood. The last glimpse Anne had of him was in the main street of Lymington. He had taken leave of them with a wave of the hat, and then stooped to pick up a cigarette end that someone had thrown in the gutter. Very different from this cheerful failure was the woman Anne met in the porch of Minstead Church. Falconer and Anne had been camping in Canterton's Glen, and since provisions had given out and Jessie had a racking headache, Anne had started off alone to walk to Lyndhurst. On the way back she was caught in the squall of wind and rain, and being in Minstead village, she took refuge in the church. This little church, dim, quaint, and full of mystery, is part of the very soul of the forest. part of the forest life. Steal into it when it is empty on some day in June, and you will feel that vast and enchanted silence that lurks in the deeps of some great beechwood. And yet it is so human, with its queer galleries one above the other, its old timber, its 2 private chamber pews. Life has flowed in and out of it for centuries, the simple, alluring life of the forest. In the steep stairs that lead to the galleries, hundreds of feet have trodden in the same places, hundreds of hands grasped and polished the wooden rail. The ancient timber work, the worn stones, the queer, compact irregularity of it all, it is full of the shadows of the forest folk who have worshipped and passed away, of the ringers who have stood under the belfry and rung the bells. Few churches are so romantic and so honest, so pure with a rough and beautiful purity. It is a simple place, carved out of the heart oak of the wilderness, utterly devoid of all gaudiness and affectation. Compare it with some suburban church, and you have the whole difference between much that was old and much that is modern. Minstead breathes faith, wonder, the awe of unearthly things, the dim lore of the forest. We moderns are wonderful mechanics, but our iron cleverness is too thin and stiff. Enchantment eludes us. We shall not leave to our children buildings that breathe mystery and awe. Anne explored the church, climbed into the galleries, and set herself with interested curiosity in a corner of the private pew that is unique because of its fireplace. Then the pulpit attracted her. She wanted to find out whether the parson could see anyone asleep in the private pews, so she ascended and stood looking about her till the sound of someone coughing in the church porch drove her out of the pulpit with extreme precipitation. She had left her basket in the porch, and the basket held food for 2 days. Anne pulled open the heavy door and saw an oldish woman seated in the porch. It was still raining hard, and Anne stepped out to get a glimpse of the sky. The woman glanced up at her with dull, tired eyes. She was very thin and shabby with the slovenly shabbiness of the tramp, and her skin was yellow and wrinkled, especially about the eyes and neck. Her lips were brown instead of red, her throat mere earthy pendulous skin. "You'd better stay inside, it won't hold up yet a while." Anne turned and glanced at the woman and thought she'd never seen anyone look so repulsively ill. "No, it looks pretty black. I came in here to shelter." She sat down beside her basket. The shabby woman had an old sack on her knees. She groped in it, brought out a bit of crust, and then looked at Anne's basket. "You haven't got such a thing as a mouthful of food." The yellow face was famished and eager. Despite its ugliness, it smote pity into Anne. "Yes, here's some fresh bread and an apple. I've got jam, but if I open the pot it'll all spill. Perhaps you'd like a bit of cheese." "No, bread'll do. Break me off a crust." She began to eat, staring with glazed eyes at the opposite wall of the porch. Suddenly she looked at Anne. "Live here?" "No." The woman's face betrayed a flicker of curiosity. "You ain't tramping, sure?" "Yes." "You don't look like it." "Don't I?" "No, perhaps you're fresh." She ate very slowly and was silent a while. Then she stared fixedly at Anne. "What are you doing it for?" "Because I wanted to." "Well, drop it. Get back out of it. I ought to know." There was a snarl of sincerity in her voice that told that she was speaking out of the bitter fullness of her experience. Anne sat alert yet meditative. The woman had reawakened the thoughts that Winchester had first roused in her. "It's a rough life," she said presently. "Rough!" It was yellow and emaciated death looking up scornfully when youth repeats words whose significance it does not understand. "Rough! You wait a while. You're young, and you may have a man with you. The rain and the dirt tell. Have you ever been left ill in a ditch on a winter night? Tramping. I needn't say I wasn't bred to it. I just fell out of the train, and when you're out, 'tain't easy to get in again." Anne's eyes were puzzled. "Train? Were you hurt?" The woman gave her a queer look. "I call it the train, what folks call the social scheme, rents and work and bylaws and the price of things and all that. You see, it's like this. Unless you got some sort of solid seat under you, you don't count. You ain't rooted like. You just drift and don't signify. You ain't got nothing to bargain with, and people who ain't got nothing to bargain with don't get into the train. How long did it take me to find that out? Not long. Just one filthy wet winter. You got to have your own bed and your own back garden to signify anything. Stray dog. People chuck stones. They don't want stray dogs about their blessed homes." Anne watched her yellow hands breaking the bread. "It doesn't sound very cheerful." "Don't it? Ever been ill on the road?" "No." "You wait. That'll cure you." Anne remained silent. With a shadow of thought between her brows, the rain had stopped and the woman was rolling up her sack. "Have you far to go?" Anne asked her. The tramp showed a few ugly teeth behind her brown lips. "Far to go? How you talk! Why, we never get anywhere, and I'm done for. If you like, I'll show you what's got me." She made as though to open her frayed and soiled black bodice, but Anne's eyes said, "Don't." "Squeamy. You'll have to get over that. Well, I'm an Essex woman, and it's in Essex I want to step off. Infirmary bed, that's the end of it, if you don't go stiff in a ditch." She got up and gave Anne a sort of pitying and familiar nod. "You get out of it. Get back among the people as has got places." Anne watched her go down the churchyard path and disappear towards Minstead village. This old cancer-bitten tramp came with the breaking of the weather, and when the weather breaks in England after a fine spell, God help those who cannot swear. The sky cleared to a thin blue over Minstead Church, and when Anne reached their camping ground in Canterton Glen, she found Jessie asleep in the little forest shelter they'd built under an old stunted holly that grew in the shape of a great sentry box, hollow within but dense and black without. Jessie had spread the mackintosh sheets over the roof of the shelter, and no rain had worked through. That evening the sunset was treacherously splendid. Purple clouds with wet gold edges went trailing across the west. The air was clear, fresh and still, and sounds carried a great distance. Anne, as she tended the fire that was to boil their kettle, felt that the last summer day had gone. Winter and grey skies, wet winds, and a draggled drift of mud and sodden leaves were upon her horizon. The long, sweet, careless spell had gone. As the dusk deepened, a shiver of depression went through her. She glanced up at the sky as though expecting cold autumn rain. The smell of the forest had changed. It was no longer crisp and vital, but sodden and very sad. For the first time since she and Faulkner had been together, Anne felt lonely and vaguely afraid. The wood fire was the one warm red spot in the midst of the melancholy dusk. She stretched out her hands to it and recalled what the old tramp had said in the porch of Minstead Church. A sudden passionate desire to be touched and to be talked to seized her. "The fine weather's breaking." She looked round at Jessie as she spoke. He was sitting in the shelter with his arms about his knees, and his face was placid, thought-wrapped and far away. "Is it?" "Yes. You should have seen the sunset." She stared at the fire in silence, as though she expected Faulkner to make some mental move. He would have to adjust this life of theirs to new conditions, but Faulkner was in one of those indolent, musing moods. For the moment, the more sensitive and outwardly conscious part of him was asleep. Anne waited for him to say something, but nothing came. Her sense of loneliness increased. It was as sudden and sad as the falling of the autumn night. "We shall have a lot of wet after all this fine weather." Jessie stirred slightly. November's not a bad month.
Yes, some years.
She stifled a sigh and put more wood on the fire.
Where do you think of turning next?
We might push on a bit further.
But it won't do in bad weather.
The weather hurts people much less than they think. We're a tough lot in the country.
Anne's lips trembled a little. She looked at Jessie and then away into the gathering darkness. A gust of wind went rustling about the holly, sending the flames slanting from the fire. You'll have to have shelter sometimes, Jessie.
Don't you worry about me. I shouldn't mind a night in the workhouse now and again.
Would you, Nan?
It's all experience. You have to bury your money before you go in.
I shouldn't mind, as long as you didn't. Her voice had a shade of dreariness, but Jessie did not notice it. He went on as though talking to himself.
We've got the money. Living like this costs next to nothing, and we're free. We're not tied up in a corner. You move on and feel the new folk and the new places round you. I should like to go down to the sea sometime and hear big waves breaking. You don't get stuck with your feet in a ploughed field. He was talking against the whole current of Anne's desires and yearnings, but she held the kettle over the fire, pressed her lips together, and smothered all that was in her heart. That cottage that she had thought of with its neat firelit kitchen. Jessie's mind seemed set against such things, and Anne shivered a little and could not speak to him of all that she longed for and all that she feared. Contentment often brings denseness, and Jessie was very dense that autumn night. It is so easy to imagine that those whom we love will be happy in the life that we wish to live. Moreover, Jessie was blind. Even his tenderness was likely to blunder along byways, missing the straight road to a woman's thoughts. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 32. For the next few weeks Anne strove very hard to be cheerful, and to hide from Jessie much that was passing in her heart. It became a point of honour with her not to let him suspect that she was beginning to hate this wandering life and long for some corner in the world that they could call their own. Anne told herself that she had insisted on sharing Falconer's life, and she knew that during the months that were past she had made herself 100 times more necessary to him than she had ever been at Fox Farm. So she made a brave bid for laughter and the joie de vivre, and fought against the suggestion that she was in any way discouraged. The weather was vile even for England. A cold, wet blight came out of the north, and for days the world was wrapped in a grey drizzle. Matters were bearable till the summer dried ground became waterlogged. Then November was suddenly November, with mud and slime and ugliness. A great hand seemed to have passed a wet sponge over the earth and wiped away all the beauty. Greyness and a fog of rain hung everywhere. The dank autumn foliage dripped and dripped without cessation. 2 or 3 glimpses of blue sky in as many weeks, that was all that Anne could remember. Men went to their work dully and sulkily, with sacks over their shoulders or wrapped in monstrous old coats. In the dusk one heard the dull, dispirited crunching of their boots as they tramped home, sodden and silent. Yet the countryman wakes up to momentary cheerfulness when he meets a comrade, and can curse and grumble. The grey weather was pelted with red adjectives. 10 successive days of rain, such weather fills a labourer's boots, but it does not fill his pocket. Now Falconer's blindness seemed to render him less susceptible to the influence of bad weather. The days were still, though wet.
and there was no virago of a wind to bluster and nag. Well shod and well clothed, Jessie did not mind the rain upon his face, and being a man of the fields, mud troubled him very little. And with Anne making a spirited fight against depression, Falconer found the life very bearable for them both. The glamour of the late summer was still upon him, and the sunlight was in his blood. Moreover, luck helped them at nights. They lay undisturbed in a succession of barns, outhouses, and stackyards. His pipe and his meals, the sense of the open road, the touch of Anne's hand and the sound of her voice filled Jessie's day for him. These things remained to him, nor did he see the grey sky and the dreary sodden roads. Late in November they found themselves in East Sussex, tramping along the road that leads by Hurstmancoe and Dorham Street to the old town of Battle. In Battle it happened to be the day of the cattle fair, and on such a day the East Sussex town is in a primitive and bovine humour. Cattle and country folk clog the main street, and the green by the Abbey gate is turned into a fairground with booths, coconut shies, a steam roundabout, and the like. Voluble young Jews sell clothes by Dutch auction. There are swarthy, blue-chinned, gypsiest gentry, who run ponies up and down the street, hang round the pubs, and punch each other on occasions. In the old days cattle lined the street from the church to the police station, and the dirt and disorder were magnificent, but the old fair has dwindled. Its dialect and its distinctiveness are on the wane. Anne and Falconer entered the town by the North Trade Road and were swallowed up by the crowd of men and beasts. What with the shouts and the sticks of hairy-faced drovers and the eccentric impulses of the beasts that were driven, the main street had a certain feeling of unrest. It was a day when men drank fairly freely and drove fairly freely through the thick of the crowd. A few yells and a cart rolling under the weight of 3 or 4 irresponsible gentlemen would charge along the crowded street. Luckily people came out in a good temper, expecting to be hustled and shoved. Anne drew Jessie against the boarded window of a shop. The Jewish clothiers had spread their stuff in the road close to the pavement and were selling at full shouting pressure, swinging bargains from arm to arm, slapping them with dramatic emphasis as the price dropped by sixpences. The stolid Sussex folk watched them as though these Hebrews were the most comical fools in the whole world. Now and again a man would try on an overcoat and turn round and round with sheepish solemnity for some domestic critic to give a verdict. There were gay scarves and handkerchiefs, umbrellas and other sundries. The Hebrews gagged relentlessly, gesticulated and sold overcoats with an air of desperation. Farther on, near a sweetstuff stall on the Green Anne, discovered a genius. The granite bulk of an old farmer served as a kind of breakwater to stem the restless spin of the crowd, and Anne took refuge there, holding Jessie's arm. A glimmer of laughter had come into her eyes at her first glimpse of the genius's face. "Just listen." "What is it?" "A man that pulls out teeth." The itinerant dentist was thick-set and swarthy, hairy about the jowl and throat, and rustily black as to overcoat and billycock. He stood on a big flat box, and his volubility and his assurance were amazing. Seen at a little distance, he would have been taken for a ferocious revivalist, shaking his fists in the face of sin and hurling furious great texts at the devil and the local pubs. A small ginger-headed boy had been put forward as a victim, and the dentist rested a dirty hand on the crown of the boy's head. "Ladies and gentlemen, it ain't any use a man taking to a scientific callin' if he ain't got observation and nimble tips to his fingers. I can assure you I've a wonderful touch, a wonderful touch. I could take a tooth out of a lady's head while she was asleep and never wake her. What? The gentleman there don't believe me? Funnier things have happened to sleeping women than that. No, what are you grinning at, sir? If you'll lie down there and go to sleep here by my box, I'll stake 3 gold sovereigns. What? You won't try it?" The sceptic grinned and looked sheepish. A friendly voice put in a remark. "You wait till the evening, mister. Wait till he's had a mug or 2. Shut up, George. 'Tain't everybody as'll let folks take their boots off and stuff 'em with cinders when they be asleep." The crowd laughed, and the extractor of teeth pounced on the boy in the moment's distraction. He put an arm round the child's neck, forced his jaw down, and got to work. The boy would have yelled had not the dentist contrived to jam the edge of his hand over the youngster's larynx. He brandished the bloody tooth in the forceps. There you are, ladies and gentlemen, easy as eating pie. There's a plucky lad, I'm going to give him sixpence because he's going to larf. What? There, didn't I say so? Here's the tanner, my son, didn't hurt, did it?
No, said the boy. I'll give you another at the same price. The dentist digressed into extolling a certain marvellous neuralgic powder of his own invention. His manner became more furious and impressive. He punched the air and preached, "Ladies and gentlemen, this powder is the most wonderful powder that ever was. What's it made of? Ah, wouldn't you like to know? One of the leading doctors in London offered me £50, but no, I'm not saying anything against doctors. This powder cures neuralgia, toothache, migraine, mal de terre, mal de mer, malcoughs, and conjunctival lacrimosis." "No, I didn't say Lucky Moses. That gentleman's over yonder selling togs. Now, I'll tell you a tale about these powders. It happened just 9 months ago when I was in Edinburgh. That's in Scotland. No, sir, the powder doesn't cure the hitch. Well, after I had addressed a select audience up yonder, an English officer came to me and asked for a dozen of these powders. A colonel he was, and he'd been in India and suffered terribly with malaria. It had gone to his head, and for years he'd had neuralgia tearing his face like the claws of a lot of crabs. Couldn't sleep. Thought of shooting himself, blowing his brains out, ladies and gentlemen. Think of the awful state of this poor gentleman had come to. Well, I said to him, 'Sir, I'm a man of my word, and Bimber is my name. You take these powders, they got the grace of God in 'em.' Well, what do you think? In 2 days' time that officer came to me looking like a sinner who had been let out of hell. 'Mr. Bimber,' he said to me, 'God bless you. I've slept peaceful for the first time in 3 years. There were tears in his eyes. He shook me by the hand, and when he'd done shaking, I found a £5 note in my fingers. 'Mr. Bimber,' said he, 'you've saved my life. If ever you want a £10 note, you come along to me.' Yes, I can show any gentleman the officer's card, Colonel Stodge Boddington of the Indian Army. Now then, these wonderful powders at 4pence halfpenny the dozen. You better be quick. I was clean cleared out of 'em in Canterbury in 33 minutes, 6 gross in 33 minutes, and each powder takes exactly 7 minutes to make. I'm a busy man, sir, you're right, often I don't get to bed till 3 in the morning." The roundabout blared, the Hebrew gentleman bawled and declaimed, rifles cracked at the shooting gallery, carts ploughed through the crowd, the public houses hummed, the waning sunlight touched the bare elm trees and the turrets of the great grey gate. The old town sprawled and chuckled and rejoiced. Discreet people looked down from discreet upper windows. Sussex folk have never been famous for good manners, and the Sussex small boy can exhibit himself on occasions as the most detestable of little beasts. Falconer and Anne loitered about Battle till the naphtha flares were lit, long enough, in fact, for a party of youngsters to mark Jessie down as something strange and singular. Singularity, to the Sussex mind, is a state that borders upon madness, and since the country labourer's experience is not of the broadest, most strangers have for him the taint of absurdity. When Falconer and Anne disentangled themselves from the crowd, they found that they had drawn with them an interested following of boys. To be blind, to be led by the hand, and to carry a pack were likely to seem monstrous eccentricities. These Sussex children began to make a mob at Falconer's heels, scoffing round him and trying to push each other against his legs. "Old Daddy Longlegs! Old Daddy Longlegs! Boo! The camel has an hump on his back!" They were ugly children, coarse children, children with hard and shiny faces. Anne led Jessie aside into Mount Street that runs northward out of the town. The boys followed, becoming more officiously insolent and rough. Anne turned and warned them off. "Mind, or I shall hit you." They put out tongues and jeered. "Old Daddy Longlegs! Yeah, you old fool!" How it was that one child came by a squashed orange, history does not say. But he flung hard and true, and caught Falconer upon the ear. The next instant Anne had caught him by the collar. The back of her hand across his mouth drew blood. From somewhere out of the darkness waddled a slut of a woman, swollen, arrogant, with a broad and dirty face. She dragged the boy aside and shot words from an ugly, slit-like mouth. "Eaten my lad, you beggar, you!"
Anne stood up to the slattern, stared her in the face, and then turned aside to Jessie. "Let's get out of this place," he said to her. The woman followed them, swearing.
"Dirty tramps! I've a good mind to fetch the police. Ya sneak off, you pair of dirty dogs!"
Anne looked white and fierce. She held fast to Jessie's arm. "If that beast touches you," he said, "I'll kill her." But the woman was content to make use of foul tongue. The boys scattered and fell off, and Anne and Jessie went on in the darkness. They were both of them angry, but their anger differed in scope and in significance. Falconer was angry with the incident, Anne with the whole series of incidents that were leading up to her unhappiness. She was country bred, and she understood by instinct the workings of the country mind. The distinction between the native and the stranger, the cottage holder and the tramp, was prejudiced and very real. She had never felt more lonely, more of an outcast than after this incident in a country town. Weariness came upon her suddenly, that soul weariness that is far more bitter than mere physical fatigue. Moreover, a woman suffers because of her womanhood more than the ordinary man ever dreams of. He wonders why she is silent and peevish, shrugs his shoulders and mutters, "Whims." But the woman is nearer to nature, and more the bond servant of nature than is the man. She has the burdens and pains to bear that are part of the life of the world. Anne said frankly, almost fiercely, "I'm tired." Jessie's sympathy was blind. He did not guess how near they were for the moment to the edge of passionate discords. "We'll go back and get a room in the town." "No, I won't go back to that place." "Shall we try a cottage?" "I don't want to be bothered with strange people." Jessie's natural gentleness smothered a possible quarrel. He put an arm round her. "I'm sorry, Nan. We've had a long day. We'll look out for something." She softened instantly with that generous impulsiveness that has been fatal to the happiness of many women. "I'm sorry I was cross, Jessie." "Were you? You want a night's rest." They were about a mile from Battle, when Anne, who had begun to accumulate experience in the matter of procuring free lodging for the night, sighted a number of outbuildings huddled together at the top of a bank. Black roof ridges and gables showed against the sky, and the place seemed silent and deserted. Anne lit the toy candle lantern that she and Jessie carried with them as part of their baggage. Steep steps led up through a high hedge to the outbuildings on the top of the bank. Anne climbed up to explore and found herself amid a nest of queer amateurish sheds that appeared to be shut in by a high fence made of ash and chestnut poles. In the corner of an open shanty she saw some sacks and a pile of straw. The shed had its back to the north wind, and Anne went back to lead Jessie up the steps and through the rough rustic gate in the hedge. She blew out the lantern candle as soon as they'd settled themselves on the straw. Anne had overlooked the fact that there was a house within 10 yards of the rough wooden palisade. It was a new house, and the sheds were the production of the amateur countryman to whom the house belonged. Anne had not noticed the house because of the high palisade, and because the only window that showed a light had been screened from the road by the bank and hedge. She had taken off her hat and was unfolding one of the blankets for Jessie when the open front of the shed flashed into one white glare. "Come out of that!" The voice spoke from somewhere behind the brilliant core of this white blaze. It was a cultured voice, but sharp and irritable. "Come out of that! Tumble up! We don't want tramps here!" Anne could see nothing but the white circle that spread its brilliant rays into the shed. She spoke to the voice behind the lamp. "We aren't doing any harm." "I don't want to argue. Get out of it. No nonsense." Then Falconer spoke blindly and into the darkness. "We'll pay to stay here." The man who carried the acetylene headlight cleared his throat impatiently. He was a thin, fairish, irritable young man wearing a pince-nez and a very well-worn Norfolk jacket. "Look here, I'm not taking any, see? Just you clear out and be quick about it." Anne pinned on her hat and rolled up the blankets, the man keeping the motor lamp turned full upon them. He watched Anne with an increasing curiosity, but his irritability was stronger than his interest. "Hurry up! My supper's getting cold." Anne rose and stretched out a hand to Jessie. Then she turned to the man with the lamp. "Please, I can't see." He swung the headlight round so that the rays fell on the gate and the hedge and the steps. Anne went first, leading Jessie by the hand and telling him where the steps began. They were halfway down the bank before the man with the lamp realised that Faulkner was blind. He made a vacillating movement toward the gate, hesitated, and then turned back. "Poor devils!" The man with the lamp knew that an irritable temper is responsible for much of the roughness of life. He criticised himself freely as he went back to resume his supper, for he was a self-conscious young man and benignant when he was not bothered. But self-criticism generally ends in theorising and the contemplation of abstract evils. The householder rebuked himself for feeling any regret. "Don't be an idiot. The beggars had no right there. Hurt the girl's feelings? Rot. Such people don't feel much. They'd get too well tanned. She was just a bit pretty, rather provocative. Great Scott, what an ass you are!" Faulkner and Anne went on down the road, and in Anne's eyes were hot and bitter tears. The words of the old tramp in the porch of Minstead Church recurred to her, and she knew that they were true. To have no home and no abiding place was to be an outcast and a wastrel. Voices became rough and threatening, even kindly faces dour and suspicious. Anne felt humiliated and very tired. She longed with her whole heart for some corner that she could call her own. End of chapter 32.
Chapter 33 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Arnav Darnal. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 33. Faulkner could not see that Anne was growing thin and that she showed little shadow lines of strain about the mouth and eyes. That indefinable soft bloom that she had possessed in her pale, dark-eyed way had begun to fade. Her features grew sharper, and her whole face looked smaller and less round, while her lips lost their vividness, and her hair its gloss. Faulkner had never felt in finer health. The long tramps, the sense of comradeship, the day's healthy hunger had put him in good condition. He seemed to absorb a careless cheerfulness from the life, and its casual and irresponsible moods suited his whole temperament. Nor did he feel, as he might have done, the unhappiness that had gripped Anne's heart, for the girl kept a cheerful surface, and her tenderness to him was greater than before. She felt at war with the life they were leading, not with Jessie. Her own incipient unhappiness made her hunger more for the man's love, and, as so often happens in life, the man blundered blindly over the woman's ideals, while she, made miserable, clung to him the more closely. It was as though the two had changed temperaments, Jessie taking the girl's will to live, she his prophetic melancholy. More than once, Anne had spoken to him of the future, but she had learned unselfishness in her early years, and her very unselfishness weakened her cause. She was not outspoken enough, too much tied by the thought that the life was her own choice. One of the lessons that a generous woman has to learn is that she must bargain with the man, hold herself aloof at times, persist in emphasizing her own personality. A man's love is often a blundering, preoccupied thing, tender enough in moments of sentiment, but pathetically blind to the dead level of a woman's day. He may tread his own chosen road, sweeping his maid along with a confident benevolence, talking of his own affairs, and often not waiting to hear her answers. Woman was the shadow that followed, and mimicked the gestures of the man. But all this was doomed to change. The first glimmer of progress forecasted it. Yet, the average man, by hereditary habit, still absorbs the woman's love into himself. He has not learned to look on her as a soul apart, as the true comrade, as a friend who has the rights and liberties of a friend. The two shall be one flesh. That was the old saying. We put less store upon the flesh now and think more of the comradeship of souls. Woman is no longer the mere bedfellow or the mere shadow of the man. In his attitude towards the future, Faulkner was vague and cheerful. He acted as though there was no need for them to come to immediate grips with it. They could wander about the country as they pleased, helping out their money with occasional jobs such as wood sawing on Jessie's part, fruit and hop picking and the like on Anne's. This vagabond life cost them little beyond their food and the price of shoe leather. Jessie had not learned to yearn yet for his own inglenook and the warmth of his own fire. Anne had talked of the future and had had material visions of their sinking some of their capital in a little shop, and Jessie had laughed at her with a lover's good humour. What sort of shop, Nan? She had not laughed with him at her own vision. A village shop? Yes, and what sort of experience have you for that? Besides, everything would fall on you. She had sat musing, her face grave and troubled. How many things there were that even the best of men failed to foresee and to understand. I might work up a little laundry business. Well, I could turn the wringer and the mangle and draw water. There's something in that. Don't laugh at me, Jessie. I'm not laughing, Nan. But aren't we getting along very well as we are? The inertia of his contentment was more baffling than any selfishness, for his happiness was not a selfish thing, seeing that it believed Anne to be happy. Those autumn weeks had found her full of a tender, laughing joy in life, and she had hidden from Jessie the change that had come since then. She had tried to hint at the truth without hurting him, but Jessie had not understood. Coarser and more selfish women would have blurted out hard facts and gained their ends by a show of ill temper, or perhaps by emotionalism and tears. Anne was too patient, too deeply in love with the man. She set herself to endure for a while the life he had chosen, knowing that some inevitable and natural crisis would arise, a crisis that would give him understanding. From Battle they tramped to Rye, and from Rye westward again towards Lewes. The weather had improved for a while, but in the down country they came upon stagnant, misty days that were full of melancholy and dejection. The great grey hills looming against the grey sky oppressed Anne with their emptiness and their desolation. The vast, unchanging apathy of the downs wearied her. She longed for the wooded country, even for the wet, leaf-clogged valleys where the hedgerows shut one in, and miles of smooth, melancholy hills were not forever drifting into dreary distances. Some miles beyond Lewes, Anne lost her way on a downland by-road just as the winter dusk was falling. Rain was coming up from the southwest, wiping out a wet and streaming sunset. Darkness falls very swiftly on such an evening, darkness that is impenetrable and ghostly. The by-road was as deserted as a track in some new and spacious land, and not a light blinked through the murk of the wet night. Low grass banks edged the road, and here and there grew a stunted thorn. There seemed nothing left for Anne and Jessie but a night under the shelter of one of these trees. In the dusk, Anne chose a thorn that looked larger and denser than its fellows. They spread their sheets on the bank and made a silent and listless meal. Jessie had caught some of Anne's despondency. When they settled themselves for the night, he tried to persuade her to take both blankets. Anne would not hear of it, and made him keep his own. I shall be all right, Jessie. He was troubled on her account, and felt her dress and the place that she had chosen. Sure, Nan? Quite sure? Is the rain coming through on you? No. Put the outer blanket over your head. I shan't. You keep it. The night was miserable enough, but Faulkner fell asleep. He did not know that Anne had given him the best place, and that she was lying where the rain came mizzling through the branches of the thorn. Nor did Anne sleep that night. She sat up and covered herself with the waterproof sheet, stretching out a hand from time to touch Jessie and feel whether the rain was soaking through on him. By midnight, she felt the raw air in her very bones. A great chill had struck her, and she was cold to the heart. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 34. Anne was astir with the first glimmer of the dawn when the hills loomed huge and dim through a grey twilight. She had a feeling as of some fatal thing having happened to her during the night, as though her body had been touched by death and still shuddered with the fear of what might follow. The drizzling rain had ceased, and there were patches of blue in the brightening sky. Anne was so cold and so stiff that she warmed herself by running up and down the muddy road and beating her arms across her bosom. Falconer still slept, and Anne looked at him with a kind of forlorn wistfulness. She had brought back some warmth to her body, and as the light increased she saw a beech hanger in a hollow in the hillside above the road. Armed against her dejection and her forebodings came the thought that she might find sticks up yonder for a fire, and that it would be better to do something rather than loiter in the raw morning air. A warm flush came to her after a brisk scramble up the hillside, and she found dead wood in the beech hanger and returned with an armful to the thorn tree by the road. To attempt to make a fire with damp wood on wet grass sounds to the town dweller like a mere foolish test of a mortal's patience, but an old labourer will make a fire with a few green sticks, and have his black pot boiling in the thick of a shower of rain. Anne had the firemaker's art, the trick of adding stick by stick, of never being in a hurry. She found dry matches and an old newspaper in Jessie's pack, and when Falconer awoke there was a good fire burning. Anne had slung the kettle on a tripod of sticks, and the flames were licking its black bottom. "Hello, Nan, you've been busy." He had smelt the smell of burning wood and heard the spitting of the flames. As for Anne, the fire had cheered and warmed her, and she answered him calmly as she knelt and fed the fire. Falconer had wakened to a sense of well-being. It did not occur to him for the moment to think how Anne had passed the night, or to suspect that she had been miserable and chilled to the heart. And Anne confessed nothing. She tended the fire with the preoccupied look of a woman whom nature has touched upon the shoulder and uttered significant words. "The rain has stopped, hasn't it?" "Yes, the weather looks much better." "Where'd you get the wood?" "Up in Beechwood yonder." "What a mate you are, Nan! And I'm a great helpless clog." She looked round at him with a sad, meditative smile. "I like doing it, Jessie." "You're just wonderful." "No, I'm not wonderful at all. This sort of life is just day by day. Now and again you can get a glimpse of the distance." Falconer seemed to hang over her words. "What do you mean, Nan?" "Mean? Nothing." She shivered slightly and reached for the tea leaves that she had measured out into a tin mug. For the next 2 days they wandered northwards, leaving the down country and striking across the Weald. Once more they were in wooded lands, though all the leaves had fallen save some on the oaks and upon the hornbeam and beech bushes in the hedges. The wind worked towards the north, and a hard blue sky presaged a sharp frost. Lights gleamed brightly when night came, and there was more sparkle in the air. On the 3rd day they turned eastwards, and Anne started the morning with bright eyes and a flushed face. Waves of heat and little ripples of cold ran through her with queer tinglings of the skin. Her head ached and felt dull and turgid, and she noticed that she was short of breath. There was no pain in her chest as she walked, but something seemed to be stifling within it and struggling to get air. Anne had been reticent about herself since that night on the downs, and Jessie, suspecting nothing, cheerfully welcomed the colder weather and the clean, clear smell of the frost. "It's good to feel the roads getting dry and hard." "Yes, we must pick up lodging tonight unless we're lucky in the matter of stacks. After all, a good frost is the finest physic in the world." It was not till they made a halt about noon that Anne began to cough. It was a sharp, dry cough, short and significant, With it came a queer pain in the side, as though someone had run a needle into the skin, thrust it through and drawn the thread after it with a rough jerk of the hand. "Hello, Nan, what's the matter? Swallowed some crumbs?" The tragic humour of the thing was lost on her. Her face was watchful and bleak with the expectation of pain. "I've caught a bit of a cold, Jessie." "Have you?" He was silent a moment. His face turned towards her. "When did you start it, Nan?" "It must have been that night on the Downs." "We oughtn't to be sitting about then. He'll get a worse chill. Let's move on. What place did that chap in the cart say we could reach tonight?" "Crowborough." "We'll stop there and get a room." If Falconer could have seen the dazed, faraway look in Anne's eyes, he would never have talked of tramping half across Ashdown Forest. She was drifting into that feverish state when life becomes strange and unreal and full of painful and grotesque illusions. Jessie's voice seemed to come from a great distance, the words distinct yet without any meaning. The fumes of the fever were rising to her brain, making her consciousness a shimmering, vapoury atmosphere that distorted all impressions. The one thought that held was the thought that she must hold out until they reached the next town or village, or until someone came along with a cart and gave them a lift. "Let's start again, Jessie. Hold my hand." It lay hot and moist in his big palm. "Nan?" "Yes?" "You're feverish." The bowing forward of his head and the stooping of his shoulders gave his figure a sudden anxious attitude. "I may be. Let's get on." "But can you manage it?" "Yes, I must." Her sanity was making a brave effort to rise above the bizarre and fantastic jumble of things that her own hot-blooded bred. Jessie's hand gripped hers, and she held fast to him in turn, like one making ready to bear some spasm of pain. They were within the bounds of Ashdown Forest, a region of wild uplands and wooded valleys, where the wind blows over gorse and heather and roars through fir woods with the roar of a stormy sea. Nor were they in luck that day, for Anne had chosen one of the loneliest of roads, and nothing in the way of a cart overtook them between noon and dusk, save a governess cart driven by an elderly woman who whipped up her pony when Anne beckoned her to stop. Anne felt a feverish despair closing in on her like the despair of an evil dream. The landscape began to play fantastic tricks with her, the tall woods towering higher and higher, the dead bracken burning a fulvid, feverish bronze. Jessie's voice had become a vague, impersonal and distant whisper, though her ears began to thrill to strange bursts of sound. There seemed to be water running near the road, running and running till it fell with a roar into a deep chasm. The sounds kept up a monotonous repetition. Sometimes there would be the booming of bells. Then voices would cry out, abrupt, clamouring voices that quarrelled and chattered and filled her head with feverish tumult. She would try to steady herself and to thrust these mad things off. Her grip of Jessie's hand seemed the one bond between her sanity and the steady, reasonable world. It was towards dusk that her courage surrendered with a kind of despairing cry. "It's no use. It's no use." Falconer's blind face had grown more anxious and afraid. The dread had come to him as the dusk had come to the world. "None." "Jessie, I'm going to be ill." She coughed, and the pain of it went through her, and through Jessie also, when he felt the spasmodic tightening of her hand on his. "Jessie, I can't go any further." He put an arm round her and felt her forehead with his other hand. "Nan, what is it? Why didn't you say? It came so sudden like. I can't get any further." He was bewildered even in his tenderness, and stood there holding her to him, a great, blind, helpless man conscious of some invisible peril. "We'll stop here. Someone must come along. Bear up, my heart. Where are we?" She put a hand to her head and looked right and left. "There's a fir wood by the road and a lot of brambles and bits of grass. This way?"
"Yes."
She half led and was half carried by Jessie to a stretch of short and wiry grass under the outstretched branches of the firs. Jessie fumbled with the straps of his pack, swung it off, and began to unroll the sheets and blankets. He knelt down, felt about him, and then made her a bed. "Come, none." She laid herself down, and he covered her with the blankets, and taking off his overcoat, rolled it up and put it under her head. She felt the trembling of his great hands, and a sudden yearning of her whole soul leapt to him out of the pitiful chaos of her consciousness. She felt herself sinking into a dark sea out of which no love and life might ever emerge.
"Jessie, kiss me. Kiss me."
He bent over her and lifted her head with both his hands, and in that moment his mouth tasted a passionate and bitter dread. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 35. Anne, wrapped up in the blankets, lay under the fir boughs as the dusk deepened, while on the grass between her and the road sat Jessie, alert with anxiety and asking himself questions. For the moment he felt that he could not speak to Anne. His voice would have been none too steady, and that kiss of hers had come like the kiss of one who is snatched away and hurried towards some tragic death. When he had steadied himself somewhat, he realized that Anne might fall asleep if he didn't disturb her. So he held his tongue and kept quiet. Ashdown Forest is one of those primitive regions where the dusk comes as it comes nowhere else. For this Sussex forest can be very silent and very sullen, and the stillness of its twilight is but the darkened stillness of its day. Ashdown is still primitive in many places, despite sundry fever spots of modernity. Dusk may come to it with a hurrying gloom of clouds galloping over the hills, or with pine spears pricking black against the bloody west. On autumn and winter evenings, strange mists come stealing over the land like a vapour of ghostly multitudes, gliding, hesitating, sweeping aside. In the taking of 10 steps you may walk out of the full moonlight into the thick white fog, and when the wind is loose the sounds are eerie and multitudinous. There are whisperings, frightened voices in the gorse bushes and in the bracken and heather, and the wrath of giants in the midnight firs. The forest had one of its still and ghostly moods that night. Mists rose, dimming the stars like the diaphanous robes of the mighty dead. The stillness was heavier than any massive sound, though ever and again the fir trees fell a murmuring as though evil dreams troubled them in their sleep. The vague starlit wastes were hidden from Jessie's eyes. He could not see the melancholy shadowland before him, or the faint outlines of the distant downs above the mists, yet he felt much of it, in spite of his blindness. The dusk chilled him, and filled him with a sense of infinite desolation. The sound that separated itself from the silence was the sound of Anne's hard, quick breathing. Each intake of air sounded like a gasp, and the sound dominated Jessie's consciousness and frightened him. Yet for a while he smothered his anxiety, trying to make himself believe that this breathing meant she was asleep. Presently she began to talk to herself in the darkness, and Jessie, not realizing that it was the delirium of fever, tried to make some meaning of the words that she uttered. "What is it, Nun?" She was silent a moment. Then the monologue recommenced.
"What's the blue door for? It won't open, the rain won't drive in. Sticks. There are ants in the sticks. Brush them away. It's no use. Walk any longer. I didn't say I'd lie down." Jessie listened with the air of a man who is afraid of his own fear. The voice was a soft, busy murmur that went on and on, uttering queer, pathetic absurdities. Jessie turned slowly on his hands and knees, crawled towards Anne and touched her. "None." "What's the use? I want to look in the oven." No, don't terrify like that. Dad says, climb up and stick God with a knife because he's mean. Rosie, you've lost your garter." "No, it isn't. I wish I could lie down. Rain. If you look inside, you'll find it all hot and tired. Jessie'll kill me. Oh, no. I say, it's only 3 miles. Falconer withdrew his hand and moved away, slowly. Almost furtively. It was the delirium of fever. A murmur of meaningless words like the murmuring of the fir boughs overhead. For a while Jessie remained absolutely motionless, dazed by his own bewilderment and his utter helplessness. Then he sat up, gripped his knees, and faced the darkness and Anne's fever. That darkness! What a damned black wall it was! What could he do? Pray? It was a blind, backward impulse, but he had nothing to pray to and believed in no one who would hear. He felt like a man locked up in a cellar while someone who was very dear to him lay alone and dying in a room above. What could he do? Sit and listen? Shout? Who the devil would hear him in such a place? It was his old bad luck back again. It had dogged him along the road, biding its time and waiting for some solitary and murderous spot where it could make its spring. Jessie had no idea how long he sat there listening to Anne's mutterings and cursing like a man who had been fool enough to let himself be marooned. Fate could not have chosen a more solitary spot in the whole country. To Jessie it might have been the bottom of a half-dug well. There were lights moving in the valley below him, twin, round, yellow eyes, the side lamps of a cart. They were approaching the fir-crowned ridge, blinking and disappearing occasionally behind banks of gorse and growing dim and blurred where the mist hung in the hollows. The beat of the horses' hoofs on the pulp of the sandy road was as yet inaudible to Jessie. The man who was driving the dog-cart heard the sound of someone shouting as his horse topped the hill, where the fir wood shut out the northern sky. A few seconds later his carriage lamps showed him a tall figure, waving its arms in the middle of the road and calling to him to stop. The driver's forehead puckered itself momentarily into an aggressive frown. He took the whip out of the wick socket, being by no means sure whether he might not have to use it. But he was a youngster with a cool head and plenty of self-restraint. Doctors come by these qualities early, if they are to come by them at all.
"Hello, what do you want?"
"Someone ill," said the voice.
"Where?"
"By the roadside."
"I'm blind, that's the bother. I'll give you £1 to let me use your cart."
The doctor was one of those keen, swarthy youngsters, sharp as a good knife, all nerve and sinew. He had come by the knack of weighing circumstances swiftly, and the man in the road struck him as genuine. There was no footpad trickery about the affair. He drew his horse to one side of the road and jumped out of the trap with the reins in his hand.
"Come here and hold me horse."
"I can't see you."
"This way, straight on."
He had no doubts now about Jessie's blindness.
"Here you are. Hold the nag's head, got him? Now, what's the matter? I'm a doctor. I'm in a hurry."
"My wife's ill."
"Where?"
"Just yonder by the fir trees. She must have caught a chill, but she kept it quiet. Now she's in a fever. I did what I could, but when you're blind and on a strange road you aren't much use. I just had to sit and wait." The doctor looked steadily into Jessie's face. He was summing the man up and seeking professionally for the cause of his blindness. He began to take off his gloves. Lost your sight by accident?
Yes, sir.
That why you're tramping?
Not altogether.
You don't look the part.
It isn't a matter of necessity. I chose the life.
I see. Hold the horse. I'll go and have a look at your wife.
He took one of the carriage lamps, and skirting the grass at the edge of the road, soon found Anne lying under the shadow of the firs. In the restlessness of her delirium she had thrown off the blankets, and the lamplight fell upon the slim figure in its black dress, the hot, flushed face, and the tangle of black hair. The doctor held the lamp close to her, and his eyes saw much that they had expected to see, for he had heard Anne cough as he crossed the grass from the road. The flushed face, the bright, delirious eyes, the quick, troubled breathing filled up the picture. The trained intellect absorbs observations as the ordinary consciousness absorbs impressions. He knelt down and felt her pulse at the wrist, the line of his mouth growing harder as he gauged the rate at which the heart was galloping.
Rotten. Delirium isn't usual, but nothing ever is usual except in the textbooks.
He bent over her and laid an ear to her chest, his listening profile outlined against the black bodice as he held the lamp away from him with his left hand.
Not much doubt about that. Seems likely that this blind chap will be a widower.
In another minute he was with Jessie, an incisive young man who was not afraid of being brutally frank.
"You've been sleeping out, I suppose?"
"Yes."
"Got pretty wet a day or two ago?"
"There was some rain, the end of last week. What do you think, sir?"
"Think! I think you're a born fool to drag a slip of a girl about the country at this time of the year."
Jessie's blind face flinched as though the words were blows. This young man had not learnt that tolerance that comes from a long contact with the complexities of life. He was a raw product, keen and biting. A year past as house surgeon in a large general hospital had given him a decisive and half-bantering roughness that the time and temper of the public would smooth away.
"Come along. We must get her into my trap. Lead the horse this way. Oh, I'd forgotten. You're blind. Hang on to me arm."
They moved up the dark road, Jessie walking mechanically, with a feeling of vile emptiness at the heart. He was trying to ask the hard young man something, but the words would not come. He found his voice as the horse and trap stopped. "Is there much wrong?"
"Everything's wrong. She'll be dead in 24 hours if we don't get to work pretty sharp."
End of chapter 35.
Chapter 36 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. It was Jessie who lifted Anne in his arms and carried her from the fir wood to the trap, the doctor guiding him with a hand on his shoulder. To Falconer, it was a moment of supreme anguish and distress. The truth had been told him with rough abruptness, and the frail, fluttering, feverish body that he carried stirred in him a rush of infinite tenderness and fear. The doctor had picked up Jessie's baggage, the blankets, and Anne's little basket. He let down the tailboard and pushed them under the seat. "Hold on a moment. I'll climb in first." He climbed into the trap and bent towards Jessie. "A bit nearer. That's it. Now, give me one of those blankets I shoved under the seat." The doctor lowered Anne into the bottom of the trap, so that she was half sitting and half lying, with her head against the seat. Jessie handed him a blanket, and he wrapped it round the girl, and folded the carriage rug under her head. Then he settled himself, gathered the reins, and set his knee against Anne's right shoulder to steady her. "I say, you there. This trap isn't built for a chap of your size on the back seat. Hang on to the tailboard. Can you run?" "Yes." "All right then. Ready?" Jessie was groping for the chains of the tailboard. He found them, and said, "Ready." The horse went off with a spurt, jerking him forward by the arms. It was a strange journey for Falconer, this blundering along behind the hammering hoofs of the horse, with the wheels grinding on either side of him, and the chains of the tailboard ice cold in his hands. It was blind anguish, stumbling at the heels of death and life, anguish that had broken into sudden passionate self-reproaches. For as he jogged along behind the cart, huge, shaggy, tragically clumsy, Falconer was enduring the exquisite torture of a man who had awakened to the fact that he had brought one who was very dear to him into danger of death. Fool! The lash of the young man's words had stung him into understanding, and the understanding that had seized on him was pitiless in its fierce sincerity. He saw things as he had never seen them before, heard a different cry in the voice of his own memories. The weeks that had passed took a new and bitterer meaning. He remembered now little things that Anne had said, silences that had become eloquent. She had foreseen what might happen, and he had blundered on over her attempts to show him the truth. Perhaps she had been suffering, and hiding her sufferings because of her love for him. What a damn, selfish fool he had been, piling his own whims upon her shoulders, and letting her struggle to live the life that he had chosen. This love of hers, he had exposed it upon the mountains, let it lie in a ditch. He had let her live his life, without asking himself whether she was fit for it, or whether she was happy. He had taken too much for granted, and his own apathy struck him now as something that had been stupendously blind and brutal. Bad luck indeed. All his life he had been exclaiming against his bad luck. The fatal drift of circumstances had been his own affair. He beheld his own ghastly inefficiency, his incapability of cherishing and preserving the most sacred thing that the world had to give. Lido! Falconer became conscious of the fact that the dog-cart had stopped, where he was thrown against the tailboard. You there? Yes. I'll have a shot and see if anything can be done here. Come forward and hold the horse. They had stopped outside a low white fence that glimmered in the light of the carriage lamps. Behind the fence stood a Sussex farmhouse, long and compact, red brick below, red weather tiling above. A ground floor window, half hidden by a ragged cypress, showed a light behind a white blind. Beyond the house were crowded the farm buildings, and somewhere a dog barked and rattled his chain. The doctor passed through a gate in the white fence and knocked at the front door. A shadow moved across the blind. There was some delay before a slip of glass above the door showed the gleam of candlelight. The doctor tapped his heels on the doorstep with the habitual restlessness of intellect in a hurry. Ah, is that you, Mrs. Bodo? Who's? You ought to know me by this time. Sure, Dr. Tuke. Why, we ain't been sending for you to the farm. No, thank your stars for that. I'm wondering whether you can manage to do me a favor. The woman was a little, stoutish person with a hard, round, sallow face. Her thin hair and her black dress were scrupulously neat. Yet she had a habit of being prim and coarse by turns, and her narrow mouth was always putting itself in order. I've got a girl in my trap. She's about as ill as she can be. I picked her and her husband up on the road. The man's blind. They've been tramping, though they've been doing it for choice. The girl caught a chill. She's jolly bad. Sure. I'm wondering whether you'd lend them a bed for a night or two. The woman's face remained blank and hard. She held the candle very steadily and very straight, and stared stolidly over the doctor's shoulder. Don't see how I can do it, doctor. The girl's awfully bad. Is she now? You couldn't get her to Forest Row or East Grinstead, could you? Sorry, I can't see my way to doing anything. Tuke had gained some insight into the ways of the Sussex folk. In this case, stolid distrust and the dislike of trouble were uppermost. He saw an implacable refusal behind the woman's obstinate face. Argument would be fatal. She had set herself to say no, and no it would be. Well, no harm in asking. It's a serious case, life and death, but a bed's a serious thing. Jessie's voice broke in. I'll pay well if the woman will only take her in. That settled the matter. The woman's face became a shade more stubborn. Can't do it. Besides, how'd I know? People off the road too. I've got the money in my pocket. Sure, that may be. I say I can't do it. And if I say I can't, I can't. The doctor turned to the gate. Of course, I quite understand that. Sorry to have disturbed you, Mrs. Bodo. Good night. Falconer's thoughts were more bitter as he hung on again to the chains of the tailboard. A slow fierceness awoke in him. He could have gone back and battered in that farmhouse door and shaken the stolid woman into cowed consent. But then he was only realizing the lot of the vagrant, testing the attitude of the dog in the kennel toward the dog that has no kennel. He was up against order, civilization, human nature. It was his own accursed folly that had brought him kicking at closed doors. The doctor drove on for another half-mile before he drew up his horse at the spot where a rutty track diverged from the road. A dark smother of wooded hills towered up on either side, and there was the noise of a stream running across a shallow, pebbly ford. A light showed about 50 yards away. It came from a cottage at the top of a bank, a cottage surrounded by old apple trees, its porch shaped out of the clipped masses of 2 old yews. The doctor hesitated a moment, doubting whether it was worth his while to try the cottage on the bank. Then he jumped out of the cart and told Jessie to hold the horse's head. "And don't you put in any shouting this time," he said. "You leave it to me." Young Took took one of the lamps and picked his way along the rutty track. He climbed the slanting path to the garden at the top of the bank, walked up a brick-paved path, and knocked at the door under the yews. "I say, Mr. Venner! Mr. Venner!" "Sir, can I speak to you for a moment?" The door opened, and the stooping figure of an old man showed in the lamplight. He was a thin, shrunken man, with the face of a melancholy old ape, and a sprinkling of grey hair over his head and chin. The little blue eyes were set in a mass of wrinkles, eyes that were full of a watery shrewdness. He stooped so much that his figure resembled the upper part of the letter C. "What be at you, doctor?" "Yes, I've got something to show you." "Something to show me?" "Yes, I picked up a slip of a girl on the road who's half dead with pneumonia. Her husband, who is with her, is blind, and just let her lie on the grass. They are not regular tramps. If I can't get her a bed pretty quickly, I might as well leave her by the roadside. Just you come and look." Old Venner stared past the doctor into the night. He blinked his eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then he went into the kitchen, put on the muddy boots he had used that day. The doctor returned with him to the trap. He held up the lamp so that the light fell upon Anne. "See?" The old man leant against the shaft and peered into the trap, and for half a minute he neither moved nor spoke, but stared at the frail black figure with its flushed face and disordered hair and swiftly labouring breath. "Sure, poor thing." He nodded his head. "You'll find the lane terribly muddy, doctor. You give me the lamp. I know where the ruts lie." End of chapter 36.
Chapter 37 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 37. Peter Venner, or Old Venom as his enemies called him, was a woodman and a wood seller, a little brown old man in a great green valley. He lived quite alone in the solitary cottage on the bank, cooking his own food, hanging his own washing on the line in the little orchard, and scrubbing his own floors. At the foot of the bank lay the wood yard, with its stacks of faggots and of cordwood, its baven shed, and its piles of ash, chestnut, and larch poles that looked like Indian wigwams. Here, too, was the open waggon shed with its huge posts, its timber tug, and its wood cart. Beside it stood the stable, where Peter's old horse grunted and nibbled his manger, a stable whose thatch was green with grass and moss. Peter Venner was a man of means, and out of the fact rose the saying, "Mean as old Venner." No doubt the old man loved money, and that when he sold wood he meant to be paid for it. In this way he had gathered a goodly share of unpopularity. Thriftless people agreed that old Venner ought to provide them with wood, but that, being the well-to-do old fellow he was, he ought not to bother about payment. But Peter Venner did bother, and bothered very viciously. He was a shrewd old man who had summed up society as he knew it, and who had no pity for the grumbling poor. A workhouse boy, old Venner had hewed his own way with axe and bill. "Only fools grumble at not having any money," he would say. "Wise folk get it. I ain't a believer in lame dogs. They're best left lame." Not a soul in those parts could understand what made old Venom take a sick tramp woman into his cottage. It was against all precedent, and some people accepted it as the first symptom of senility. Others said that the tramp woman's man must have offered Peter good money. A few of the younger women set it down to the doctor. He had such a way with him, especially when there were babies about. Peter Venner was a widower, and the only man in the neighbourhood who remembered Peter Venner's wife, in the way of her dying, was old Tom Potts, the bevan cutter.
Tom had worked for Peter Venner for 30 years, and he still remembered that November night when little Ruth Venner had been brought home in Farmer Lavender's gig. She had been knocked down in the dusk on the Maresfield Road by two drunken gypsies who were driving as only gypsies drive. Ruth Venner was still alive when Farmer Lavender brought her home, and old Tom remembered the look on Peter Venner's face when he lifted her up out of the trap. Ruth had died that night, and Peter had gone out into the woods, and not a soul had seen him for 2 whole days. If he'd been asked, Tom Potts would have said that no man had ever been fonder of his wife, and that Peter's nature had hardened after Ruth's death. He was one of those quiet men, sulky on the surface, who had hidden something that was sacred under a grim reserve. The surliest citizens are often the best husbands, and a man who is a tough customer in the rough and tumble of life may be the greatest sentimentalist at home. It may have been that this coincidence touched the wound of 30 years ago and roused something that was sacred in old Venner's heart. The facts stood for what they were worth. Anne lay abed in a little whitewashed upper room whose window looked into a tangle of apple boughs. 5 days she'd lain there, dying yet not dying, watched over and nursed in that self-same room where Ruth Venner had died, with one last little sighing breath. And Falconer sat before old Venner's fire in the room below, a man whose courage and whose fortitude were in shreds, a man who listened and could not sleep, and would not have eaten but for old Venner's orders. Dr. Tuke came and went. He was an indefatigable and utterly tactless young man, who yet contrived to get his own way in everything. The very first night Falconer had taken out his purse and handed it over to the doctor. "Get anything that can help." Tuke said, "Right-o," and appeared next morning with a trained nurse in his trap. The nurse got to work, while Tuke explained blandly to old Venner that the lady in uniform would have to have a bed made up for her in the cottage. Peter Venner looked at the young man and grinned. "You're piling up the faggots, doctor." "That's it. Let 'em all come, I say, though you're a bit of a brick." Peter went to his linen chest and made up a bed for the nurse in the back room. At his next coming, Tuke brought cylinders of oxygen in the bottom of the trap. In the little whitewashed room everything was in fighting trim, from the hypodermic syringe and strychnine tablets on the dressing table to the carefully written card of directions pinned upon the wall. Tuke was a sporting doctor. He did not believe that he had a chance of winning, but he meant to play the game to the very last minute. Each morning he exclaimed to the nurse, "What, still alive? Well, I'm jiggered." He was the most unprofessional young man in his manners, but after all, manners do not defeat death. To Falconer, these 5 days were days of the uttermost anguish. All the courage in him had collapsed, and his suspense was the mere agony of waiting for the end. He had no faith in the vague chance of Anne's recovery, so he sat and cursed himself, heaping contempt upon his blindness and putting all hope away. Already, in imagination, he saw Anne lying dead, and he knew that her death would be more disastrous to him than even his loss of sight had been. Jessie did not see how he could go on living any longer. Anne had become life, heart, eyes, the whole world to him. The thought of being left alone in the darkness frightened him, as it might have frightened a child. Again and again he said to himself that he had killed Anne. Nothing could drive this conviction out of his head, and he was so hopeless as to the future that he never asked the doctor how things went. To the anguish of Falconer's despair the words would have sounded farcical. He withdrew into the gloom of his fatalism and sat for hours before the fire. Old Venner appeared to understand what was passing in the heart of this blind and shrinking man,
Falconer was sick with suffering, and Peter Venner had not forgotten the one great tragedy of his own narrow life. He would sit by the fire at night, smoking his pipe and watching Jessie with his shrewd and watery eyes. The strange thing was that old Venner did not resent all that was happening in his cottage. It did not even strike him as absurd that he should be put to all this trouble by having these two people thrust on him out of the unknown. Perhaps there was an inevitableness about it that was justified by the memories of 30 years ago. It was old Venner who told Jessie that there was a chance Anne might live.
"The doctor says there'll be a sort of crisis. That's what he called it, crisis. Like a break in the weather, so far as I can gather."
Jessie did not believe him, and Peter Venner always insisted on being believed.
"Tell you 'tis so. The doctor knows what he's saying."
This was at noon, and Tuke, coming downstairs after his midday visit, threw further news at Jessie, who was sitting by the fire.
"We've got a fighting chance, so buck up, my hearty."
Falconer put his face in his hands and shuddered, and Tuke stared at him with semi-cynical sympathy. The blind man's consciousness was like so much raw, quivering flesh, it was hardly capable of registering impressions. Tuke went out and found old Venner in the wood yard.
"I say, Mr. Peter, that chap in there will go off his nut if we aren't careful. Can't you find him something to do?"
Old Venner scratched his chin.
"Sure, you might try him at sawing wood. That's an idea. He's like a bit of jelly, all of a wobble if you so much as touch the plate."
Peter Venner went into the cottage, his watery blue eyes blinking a little.
"I've got a job for you, young man."
Jessie turned a dazed and bewildered face.
"Come on now. 'Tain't no use you roasting yourself afore the fire. Don't help nobody. We're well nigh out of logs too. I reckon you might handle a saw."
He took Falconer by the arm and led him out of the cottage and along the sloping path that slanted down the bank into the wood yard. There was a big shed where old Venner kept much of his oak stuff that was sawn into logs for sale in the towns. Sometimes the steam saw would come on its rounds and cut hundreds of logs a day. Sometimes Tom Potts took a turn at the sawing horse. The floor of the shed was littered with sawdust, bits of bark, chips and twigs. Close to the sawing horse lay a pile of cordwood that old Venner wanted cut up for his own use.
"Can you use a saw?"
"Yes."
"Here you are then. She's set wide and runs easy, and I'll give her a grease."
He took a saw down from a nail, jabbed his thumb into a pot of grease that stood on a rough shelf, and anointed the saw.
"The wood's just by you. Feel it? And the horse?"
Falconer felt with his hands. "Yes."
"Cut him about a foot long."
"Yes, about a foot."
"And just you rip away here till tea time. I've been through it myself. I sawed wood all night by the light of a lantern because I couldn't sleep with grieving over what couldn't be mended."
So the winter day went, and the dusk came on, the stealthy beginnings of a fateful night. Falconer had worked for 5 hours at the sawing horse, but he had neither tired his body nor dulled his mind. When old Venner came to lead him back into the cottage, suspense gripped him as eagerly as ever. He hardly noticed the old man's remarks on the pile of logs he'd left beside the sawing horse. At 9, Dr. Tuke let himself in with that utter lack of ceremony that was part of his cheerful coarseness. He blew on his hands, declared that it was damn cold, and then went softly up the stairs, guided by the light that the nurse showed him from above. Falconer sat and listened. He heard them moving to and fro in the room, the creaking of a woodwork, and a broken murmur of voices. Only a few minutes seemed to have passed before the doctor came down again and picked up a glass of hot toddy that Peter Venner had mixed for him. Old Venner's eyes asked a question. The doctor answered it with a snap of the thumb and middle finger, and a dubious grimace. "Touch and go," he said in an undertone, when Venner followed him out into the porch. "She'll settle it for us one way or the other this blessed night." Falconer, with his acute sense of hearing, caught what the young man said. Old Venner returned, locking and bolting the door with troubled deliberation. He loitered about the room before he pulled up a chair before the fire, his eyes full of a shrewd and perturbed pity. His hands went mechanically into his coat pockets for tobacco tin and pipe, but when he had filled the pipe he put it aside on the high mantel-shelf and stared at the fire. "Get a bit of sleep tonight, won't you?" Jessie rocked his body to and fro with his elbows resting on his knees. "Sleep? Good Lord!" Old Venner nodded his head and wiped his mouth and chin with a red cotton handkerchief. "I reckon I'll be getting off myself. We're giving you no end of trouble." "Bah! Could have kicked you out if I hadn't wanted it." He took a paper spill, lit his candle with it from the fire. Jessie heard the creaking of the stairs as he climbed to the narrow back room where he slept. Falconer was left alone, with a dying fire at his feet and a dying woman in the room above. He would not believe that there was any hope, seeing that the bitterest thing that could happen to him was that Anne should die. Duke had forbidden him to see her. The delirium had left Anne, but Jessie had not heard her voice, for the simple reason that she was not allowed to speak. It was a question of staying power, and every needless nerve thrill of the quivering of a muscle was so much strength wasted in the grapple between life and death. Falconer had made both nurse and doctor promise that he should be given the last moments when all hope had passed, and so he sat there waiting for the woman to come and call him to the farewell. For a while he listened to the sounds from above, the gliding footsteps over the floor, the occasional murmur of a voice, the clink of glass against glass. The beams creaked in old Venner's room. Presently silence fell, silence that was utter and complete. The wood fire on the hearth went out and ceased to give so much as a crackle. There was no wind moving, and the night was frosty and very still. During the first hour of his vigil, the silence was nothing but silence to Jessie. Some time elapsed before suspense and the strained membranes of his eardrums began to create all manner of imaginary sounds. The darkness about him palpated like the blood in a great heart. He was conscious of the throbbing of the arteries at his temples, and of the buzzing of the blood within his brain. More than once he fancied that he heard footsteps on the stairs, and again that someone had called to him from Anne's room. He stood up and listened, suspense and the midnight cold making him shiver. The sounds were of his own creating, and the utter silence of the cottage contrasted with the shuffling of his feet over the bricks as he felt his way to the bottom of the stairs. He groped his way back to the chair, only to be attacked by a new dread. Supposing the nurse had fallen asleep and that Anne was dying while the woman slept. This new dread set Falconer shaking like a tremulous old man. He felt that he could remain alone no longer in the tense silence of the cottage, that he must blunder up the narrow stairs and discover what was happening in the room above. A sudden creaking of boards and the sound of someone moving saved him from blind panic. The dread went out of his heart for the moment, only to return with more poignant significance. The woman was coming to call him. Anne was dying. He was about to grasp his love's hands and feel them grow limp and cold. The footsteps continued to go to and fro, softly, patiently, the footsteps of one who fought against sleep. Jessie's imagination followed them to and fro across the floor, much as a sick man's eyes follow the moving shadow patterns of sunlight upon a wall. He became mesmerized by the ebbing and flowing of the sound above. The rhythm of these footsteps played upon his brain until, without realizing what was happening, he fell asleep, sitting upright in the chair. The dawn was at hand when Falconer awoke to the sound of an opening door. He started up, shaking at the knees, guilty as a man who had slept at his post. The pain of consciousness returned, and in the stillness he heard the sound of someone breathing. "Who's there?" He heard the rustling of a skirt.
"Are you Mr. Falconer?"
Jessie caught his breath and held it. She'd come to take him to say goodbye. "Yes, I'm ready." "Shh." "Yes. I'll come quietly, I'm ready." The voice whispered to him out of the darkness.
"It's not that. She's asleep. We've won. She's going to live."
Falconer stood swaying. He groped with his hands and then fell full length without uttering a sound. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 38. There was a cautious colloquy upon the stairs. Nurse Bissett had crept up to old Venner's room and met him coming out, candle in hand.
"Oh, Mr. Venner, the man's gone down in a dead faint."
"Eh?"
"I just told him."
"Oh, sure.
Now what is it you just told him? Life or death?"
He dropped his voice to a whisper that echoed hers, and his watery eyes peered anxiously into her face. The candle shook a little. Behind his grim brevity, old Venner sometimes hid unexpected emotion.
"I don't think there's much wrong with the man, Mr. Venner. I only told him—"
"Man! God jigger the man! 'Tain't him I'm thinking of," the nurse whispered excitedly. Her cap was awry and her emotions were inclined to take a holiday.
"Didn't I tell you? There, how one's head goes to a jelly after a tussle like this. She's sleeping. She's going to live."
"Sleeping?" His voice became absurdly cautious. He stretched out a hand and squeezed the nurse's arm. "Sleeping?"
"Yes."
"Going to live? And in that room too?" His face blazed into sudden grotesque delight. Grotesque because of the working of the muscles about his mouth. He blinked his eyes very rapidly, pinched the nurse's arm and gave way to whispering exultation.
"Going to live! Oh, good girl, you've done it! And that chap flat on the floor, well, he felt pretty soft, didn't he?"
He followed the nurse down the stairs, talking to himself in a whisper and making faces at the candle. They found Falconer kneeling in the kitchen and holding his head between his hands. He looked bewildered and shaken, a man gathering his wits together after the shock of a heavy fall. He dropped his hands when he heard Peter and the nurse enter the kitchen, and the blind face he turned to them was intensely troubled. It was as though he had been told some wonderful piece of news and had lost it again in the fog of his unconsciousness. Old Venner sniffed and rubbed his chin.
"God drat the man, don't you understand?"
He went up to Jessie.
"It's all right, man. It's all right. You needn't say your prayers."
Falconer stretched out a blind arm and knocked the candlestick out of old Venner's hand.
"Josaphat, drat my eyes, what'll the chap do next?"
The nurse went to the window and drew back the curtains, and through the casement showed the purple and orange of a winter dawn. The bare apple trees were bleak and black and strange. The grass slivered over with a hoarfrost, and down the brick path a robin went twittering. They heard a voice saying, "Is it true? Is it true?" Old Venner grimaced as he picked up the candlestick.
"She's asleep, don't you grip it. We don't want no noise."
In the dusk of the room a big figure blundered up, groped gently, found a chair and sat down before the dead fire. Peter Venner had put the candlestick on the mantel-shelf and the nurse was still at the window watching the dawn. Suddenly they turned and stared at one another, standing in stiff and constrained attitudes of people caught in the self-conscious realization of overwhelming emotion. The blind man in the chair was weeping with the self-abandonment of a child.
Old Venner jerked his head like a puppet and walked stiffly toward the door. He unlocked it, drew back the bolts, and went out and stood on the brick path under the apple trees. The keen air of the winter dawn entered his nostrils. He drew a deep breath, stretched out his lean neck, and uttered a number of swear words very softly and with an air of infinite relief and relish. Now in one corner of the woodyard, where nothing but docks and nettles grew, lay a pile of rotten, broken, banded faggots, hedge cuttings, and mildewed bracken. Peter Venner appeared drawn to that particular corner of the woodyard. His hand went tentatively into the side pocket of his coat and fingered a box of matches with cautious enthusiasm.
"Odd rabbit it! Let's have a bit of a blaze."
A trugful of shavings and half a bottle of paraffin were eager accessories, and Tuke, wheeling his bicycle up the muddy lane, had a vision of a great red flaring bonfire and the figure of an old man flourishing a pitchfork with true Catholic energy. During the 2 days that followed, Jessie Falconer spent most of the time before the fire in Peter Venner's kitchen, listening for the sound of Anne's voice in the room above. Tuke had forbidden him to see her as yet, and she was so weak that she was not allowed to speak, yet to Jessie the silence was not the long crushing silence of suspense. He was content to sit there, listening and waiting and imagining that moment when he should once more hold Anne's hands in his. He would throw the old life at her feet and ask her, of her love, to forgive him his blind selfishness. It was late on the afternoon of the 3rd day that Jessie first heard the sound of Anne's voice. Dusk was filling the cottage and fighting with the firelight. A wind moaned fitfully in the chimney, and in one of the silences between these moanings, Jessie heard the voice for which he had listened so dearly. A smiling, listening radiance swept over his face as he leant forward slightly, his hands resting on the arms of the Windsor chair. Anne was asking Nurse Bissett for news.
"Where's Jessie?" "Your husband's all right."
Anne lay quiet a moment, her eyes staring up at the ceiling.
"When can I see him?" "Oh, we'll see about that presently." "I've been very ill, haven't I?" "Ill? Good gracious, well, you needn't worry about that now."
It's an open question as to who suffers most on such occasions. The woman who's ill, or the man who waits and watches and whose heart is haunted by helpless dread. Moreover, a severe illness is a state that comprises all manner of tyrannies and privileges. Strangers enter the house with authority and create new laws and methods. They contrive things between themselves, decide as to what shall be and what shall not be legal, and even arrange little human tragicomedies for the edification of those whose authority they have seized. Thus, these two autocrats, Dr. Tuke and Nurse Bissett, chose to talk in undertones at the top of Peter Venner's steep and wainscoted stairs.
"Well, I think he might, just for a minute, but you keep an eye on him." "Oh, yes, doctor, I'm sure."
"Now, don't get sentimental. The chap's a fool, and I'm going to tell him so later on." Tuke descended kitchenwards, where Falconer waited with the air of a chained dog. The doctor seemed amused. His thin and cynical young face had a wicked benevolence that gleamed about mouth and eyes. "Hello! Still toasting yourself? Things are going on as well as can be expected." Jessie showed great restlessness. "No danger, now?" "Danger? I wouldn't say that, you know. Now, I suppose that if the girl gets perfectly well, you'll be wanting to drag her in and out of barns and workhouses and ditches." Jessie flushed. "I've thought all about that." "Don't be touchy, my good sir. We all do these silly sort of things without thinking. Why, I took my best girl for a sail at Ramsgate. Absolutely dragged her on it. Well, we don't always grasp the nastiness of some sorts of life." He turned to the door. "Do you think, doctor, I might—" "In a week, yes, in a week." The door closed rather noisily, and Falconer sank back in his chair. But Tuke was playing one of his little comedies. He waited a moment under the yews before he opened the door again and called to Jessie. "I say, I've been thinking. I might allow you just a minute upstairs." "No, if you like." Nurse Bissett, standing in Anne's doorway, heard blundering steps upon the stairs. Jessie had groped his way out of the kitchen, and she had waited long enough to lay a hand upon his arm.
"No, Mr. Falconer."
He was breathing fast, and the muscles of his mouth were twitching. "I'll be very careful. I won't do any harm. I'll—"
There, just you go in."
She slipped away rather hurriedly, and leaning her hands on the sill of the little landing window, looked at the landscape through moist eyes. Jessie was in the whitewashed room, feeling the air about him with his hands.
"Anne!"
"Jessie, where are you?"
"Here. Oh, my dear lad."
He found the bed and her hands, and going on his knees, he hid his face in the coverlet. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 39. To say that a woman can do what she pleases with a man is an unsympathetic way of stating a half-truth. The complete vulgarity that characterises the sex relationships of the average lower-class man and woman is full of significance to those who live for something better. No man lusts after his own wife when he loves her with a love that lasts. In those happy marriages that are lived out above the cynical animalism of the comic press, there is no tyranny, no vulgar self-assertion, none of that sexual cunning that deals in all the little petty jokes and nastinesses so dear to the ordinary bourgeois mind. What is a pleasure to the one becomes a pleasure to the other, either to give or to surrender. Here and there in the coarse brown earth of labour you find the streak of gold, and it is found in strange places. In Anne Wetherell you touched it, child of a loafing, boozing bully. In Falconer too, man of the soil, the gold vein rain into fine, the delicate threads. It was drawn into wires that vibrated and made that music that we call soul. Jessie began to make new plans from the very hour that Anne's life was given back to him. By New Year's Day they were sitting hand in hand like a couple of young lovers before Peter Venner's fire, and debating 101 ways of living and of earning money, and the one way in particular where Jessie might be able to use his strength. At times they were apt to be sad and a little thoughtful over the limitations that hemmed them in. There were so few things a blind man could do beyond sawing wood and turning the handle of a barrel organ. But Falconer had had his lesson. The thought of the old vagabond life not only filled him with passionate dread, but drove him fiercely towards the future, a home with Anne. The picture came to him, all firelight and soft shadows, with the desolate wind of yesterday howling hopelessly in the outer darkness. How was it that he had never seen this vivid picture before? How was it he had never heard the intimate, busy sounds of a home, the humming of the kettle, the steady stitch of Anne's needle, the contented sighing of her breath at night? Life had had to bring him to the brink of a precipice to show him this. He was learning what the words wife and home and fireside meant. At night, when Anne had gone to bed, Falconer and old Venner would sit, smoking and talking before the fire. It was not long before Peter heard all that Jessie had to tell. Old Venner was a philosopher, to judge by the remarks he made upon this most human of all tales.
"Marrying's like buying an horse," he said. "You're liable to be taken in when you're young. Some lads have the instinct, others haven't. You get took in by a few flashy points, and you don't gather what you've got till you've had the beast at home a month, in the stable. Some men can ride a tricky horse, others can't. I reckon that a vicious, lusty mare don't care for too timid a chap on her back."
When Falconer talked to the old man about the future, Peter Venner bit his pipe stem hard and was cautious.
"You've got a little money, have you?"
"Yes."
"Well, you be careful how you part with it, that's all."
This was shrewd and decisive enough, but the advice led nowhere, like the advice of most old men, old age being a state of clinging to things, of a cautious hoarding of the treasure that's been won in a man's prime. "I know all about that," said Jessie, "but I've got to get some sort of work and a home. It's for her. And I tell you I'd put on harness and draw a cart for her sake." Peter eyed him interestedly over the bowl of his pipe.
"Oh, you would you?"
"Yes, I would. She tried to live my life and it nearly killed her. Now I'm going to live the life she's longing for." Old Venner nodded.
"'Zactly. And that's what fools call being managed by a woman."
"But it isn't."
"Of course it ain't. The best part of living is when you're giving up. Though I ain't done much of that myself these 30 year. But I might ha' done. When once you've had a good partner, young man, and lost her, 'tain't so easy to find a second. It makes you so darned particular. I tell you, it makes most wenches look a lot of tawdry, good-for-nothing sluts."
When Anne was able to get out of doors one mild and sunny morning, Peter Venner took her over the garden and the woodyard. His pale blue eyes were full of twinkles as he watched the eager flushing of her face. "It's just lovely, Mr. Venner," she said to him. "It's just like the place I'm dreaming of for Jessie. Isn't it funny now? I always wanted yew trees just like that, and a brick path and a garden at the top of a bank. Jessie and I are making plans. You've been so kind to us, and we shan't be bothering you much longer." Old Venner rubbed his chin.
"Don't you be in no kind of an hurry," he said. "It don't signify to me."
But it did signify very much to this old man, for it was a fact that Anne resembled the poor Ruth Venner of 30 years ago, and that she had come into his life as Ruth had come back to her death. Without realizing the insidious nature of the feeling, old Venner had begun to take a pleasure in seeing Anne about the cottage. As her strength returned, she glided gradually into the life of old Venner's home, cooked the meals, cleaned his pots and pans, darned his socks, and chatted over the table. He no longer came back to lonely improvised meals and to dull, drowsy evenings over the fire. Someone put his slippers to warm, saw that the buttons were on his clothes, and that there was dry wood ready for the morning fire. It was all done so simply and so unostentatiously, without any suggestion of getting round the old fool, that Peter Venner found the habits of 30 years crumbling away into grievous ruin. It came upon him suddenly that he had been a lonely old man, and for the first time in a great number of years he was the victim of self-pity. A new sociability had been awakened in him. He found it pleasant to be cared for, to come home and find a happy-faced young woman busy in the kitchen. He remembered how he'd kicked off his muddy boots in the back kitchen night after night for a monotonous number of years, cooked up some mess of food, smoked a pipe, totted up figures on the back of an envelope or an old bill, and then crawled off to bed. That had been all very well in its way, but he'd tasted something better. Anne could cook, and her voice was a pleasant sound in the cottage. Moreover, he had not been put out of pocket by the girl's illness. Falconer had paid the old man good money. Otherwise, even Anne's likeness to his dead wife might soon have squandered much of its inspiration. During those January days, Falconer fell into moods of immense energy. He would make Anne lead him down to the sawing lodge, and the purr of the saw would go on hour by hour. Old Venner would come and look at the mountain of logs that Jessie had cut, rub his chin, and meditate. Then old Tom Potts, the bavin cutter and odd man about the yard, went down with bronchitis and was listed on his club. Tom was not likely to do much more work in this world, so the doctor said.
"Better get a young man in, Mr. Venner."
But Peter loathed young men.
More money and less time, that's their tuning these days. I'll have none of 'em.
Which meant that he was faced with possible problems. Lying in one corner of the woodyard was the limb of an oak tree, with the bark rotting off it and the wood turning to white pulp. The thing had lain there for years because of its weight and because old Venner had not bothered, but being a man of foresight and understanding, he took Falconer to where the oak limb lay, and asked him if he could lift it. Jessie put his hands to the slippery, woodlice-ridden mass, felt it as a wrestler feels his adversary, got a grip and a heave, tilted the thing on end, stooped, set his teeth, and had the limb on one shoulder. "Where do you want it?"
"In the sawing lodge."
"All right, give me the lead." And the oak limb went down with a crash on the chips and dust of the sawing lodge floor. Old Venner blinked his eyes. That great log of oak had banged down the balance of his indecision. He rubbed his chin and looked at Jessie with approval and satisfaction. When he left the yard about dusk, after loading up his wagon with faggots for a journey on the morrow, he entered the cottage by the side door that led into the little back kitchen. Sitting down on a stool by the copper, he began to unlace his boots while the voices of the two who were talking before the fire came to him from the front kitchen. Neither Jessie nor Anne had heard the lifting of the latch, and since one of Peace's laces had worked itself into a knot, he was excused for hearing all that was said. "I'm strong enough now, Jessie. I could walk 20 miles, sure."
"I'm not going to drag you about the roads, Nan."
"Well, there's the railway, though we don't want to waste any money now, do we? Still, we've got to look about us. I suppose you'll want to be going Guildford way?"
Jessie's "I guess so" was thoughtful and rather sad. His voice brightened up the next moment. "We shall come out all right, Nan. We'll find a quiet corner somewhere. I've set my heart on getting her home." Old Venner concluded from the sounds that he heard that Anne went over and kissed Jessie. Peter kicked his boots rather noisily across the brick floor, groped for his slippers, and shuffled into the kitchen. He had a glimpse of Anne's startled face and the glimmer of tears in her eyes.
"Why, Uncle Venner!"
She had thrust the pleasant intimacy of this title upon him of late.
"Why, Uncle Venner!"
He mocked her with a dry twinkle.
"I didn't know you'd come home."
"Didn't you know? My bootlaces were contrary. They liked to get in a tangle and make an old man swear."
Anne looked meaningly at Jessie and held her breath.
We were talking over things, Uncle Venner. You've been very kind to us, but we've got to make a corner for ourselves."
"Sure. So you're thinking of moving, are you? I've been doing a bit of thinking myself."
He paused, cocked an eye, sat down, pulled out his pipe, blew through it, and then rapped it on the fender.
"I've been thinking—"
Anne's eyes were perfectly innocent.
"What about, Uncle Venner?"
He looked up at her with the firelight on one half of his face.
"About a partner. I'm an old man. I shan't do much more heavy work, but look at him yonder. Can't he saw wood? Can't he carry half a tree on his back? Couldn't he load up faggots and cordwood and poles? Ain't he got a bit of money?"
A number of emotions passed over Anne's face. She opened her mouth, but remained mute, while Falconer turned towards old Venner's voice.
"Do you mean it?" "Sure. It's a business that pays. Might pay better if there were a man to bother. More money makes more money. We could hire a respectable chap to take Tom's place, and there's no knowing. Why, God bless me, child, you ain't no fool, you see."
Anne's knees were trembling under her. Words came somehow, quick, impulsive, eager words.
"But where do we live?"
"Aren't you living here already? 'Tain't a bad little place, and there's room even for children."
Anne gave a sharp cry.
"Oh, Uncle Venner!"
She ran and kissed him, and the old man caught her and kissed her back.
"There, there, my girl, go and give him one too, or he'll be fractious. Darn them bootlaces of mine, they would listen. Well, well, let's have a bit of a smoke. What? Want to shake hands, Jessie? All right, sure. Give the lass an hug. What? Where's me damn pipe got to?
Somebody had wet eyes, and that was the beginning of a bargain. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 40. To go down into the deep woods on a spring morning is to descend into a place where the hush of mystery hangs like the hush in some great temple whose pillars stand black against the dawn. Peter Venner had said at breakfast,
"There be them faggots to fetch up out of Bolden Wood, Jessie. The ground's hardened a bit. 'Tain't so mucky as it was last week."
"2 loads, aren't there?"
"Sure. Nan, my girl, would you like a jaunt in the wagon? Lock the door and put the key in your pocket."
"Then you'll have a cold dinner, uncle."
"Well, I've put up with a number of cold dinners in my time."
Billy the horse was harnessed to the light wagon, Anne and Jessie doing the work between them while Peter looked on and finished the plug of shag in his pipe. All 3 of them mounted into the wagon, Anne glancing up at the bloom on the apple boughs and at the clumps of daffodils in the grass. She had begun to love the place as her very own, and each new flower and shred of colour that the spring brought with it filled her with a new wonder and joy. Peter took the reins, balancing himself on the broad gunwale of the wagon. They had brought a stool for Anne, so that she rode like a queen in a village triumph. Bolden Wood was a green abyss into which a woodland track wound like a mule path down a mountain. The wheel ruts were half a foot deep in places, and where the ground was rotten and boggy, faggots had been thrown down and crushed into the clay. The wagon rolled like a ship at sea, and old Venner had climbed down to walk at Billy's head. Anne left her stool and went and sat by Jessie on the broad rail. The wooded slopes towered up against the sky, and though a strong wind was blowing, in Bolden Wood everything was very still. The tops of the highest trees swayed but a little, though white clouds were racing across the blue. The sunlight came down in great streams, striking on the green moss that covered the pedestals of the oaks, shimmering upon the hollies and making the shadows that lurked about the hazel stubs very black and sharp. The underwood had been cleared that winter, and Bolden was a splendour of flowers. Above the brown carpet of dead leaves, in mossy places, among the tufts of coarse grass, on lichened banks they covered the ground with colour. Primroses lay in yellow sheets, wild hyacinths in masses of mysterious blue. A scattering of anemones still kept up the imagery of snowflakes fleeking the ground. Lord and ladies in glabrous green made a pastoral idyll, with the milkmaid in her mauve-white smock. Above, the golden leaf buds of the oaks glimmered beside the black buds of the ash. As for celandines, you found them like drops of gold in moist places, with ferns spouting out of hazel stubs and mosses richer than any velvet. Bluebells grew thickly where the faggots were stacked in an open space beside the ride. Anne cried out with joy of a child jumping down to gather a handful, while old Venner trampled them underfoot. She ran back to the wagon and thrust the flowers into Jessie's face. "Smell! They're rich. Thick as corn, Jessie, and the primroses." "I can smell the primroses. I can smell the whole wood. And the spring." He climbed out of the wagon. "Shall I carry, uncle?"
"Aye, lad. I'll take and load 'em. Nan'll give you the lead."
Anne took Jessie's hand, and he paced the ground from the tail of the wagon to the faggots, counting every stride. "That's the number, Nan. Now I shall know where I am. I'll throw you a faggot down to sit on. Are they piled high?"
"No, laid one against the other."
Call out if you see me going wrong." He took a faggot in each hand, gripping them by the bands, and paced his strides back to the wagon. His sense of direction and of his surroundings had become wonderfully acute, and the ends of the faggots brushed the tail of the wagon before he had taken his sixth stride. Peter Venner was standing up above to take the faggots from Falconer and pile them into a load. "Let me try and do the whole job, Uncle." "Sure, why shouldn't you? That's enterprise. I'll stand on the shaft and tell you if you're wrong." Jessie went to and fro, trampling the bluebells, lifting faggots into the wagon, and then climbing in after them to load them one by one. Old Venner watched him narrowly, for there is an art in loading a wagon, and much can be done by the mere feel of things. The faggots had to be packed closely and firmly, yet not so roughly as to break the bands, and a faggot, especially when it has oak or birch twigs in it, can be as tenacious and cussed as a loose length of barbed wire. Jessie was very patient and very methodical. More than once he was switched across the face, but he took the cuts philosophically. Peter Venner had an occasional suggestion to make, and sometimes he turned to Anne and smiled at her with an air of comprehensive satisfaction. "We'll make it 3 easy loads, Jessie. Billy'll have enough to do up the slope. Better 3 journeys than getting stuck with an overload." When Peter was satisfied, they roped their load and started for home. Anne took Jessie's hand while old Venner led the horse through this world of flowers and a perfect colour. It was easy going in the wood bottom, but when the winding road began, old Billy took to blowing and to straining at the traces. Peter gave him a rest. "There's a soft spot ahead, Jessie." "Let me get at the back and shove." They started again, Jessie putting his weight against the tail of the wagon. He looked big and strong enough to thrust the thing up a hill alone, and Anne watched him with a woman's pride. The wagon sailed triumphantly out of Boldenwood, Billy plodding along with the satisfied air of a horse who had nothing to grumble at and whose pulling powers were more than equal to the load at his heels. Peter was cheerful and jocular. "There's summat in being strong. The Lord may not glory in the muscles on a man's back, but I tell you they're darned useful." So they fetched the faggots out of Boldenwood, and Jessie proved that a blind man can train himself to be of use. One of these spring days, Falconer had a letter forwarded to him from the Temperance Hotel at Guildford, and Anne read it to him on the seat under one of the apple trees in the orchard. It was a letter that ran to no more than 6 lines, 6 poignant, hateful, yet prophetic lines so far as Anne was concerned. She drew breath at the end thereof, like one who's come through a crisis and sat for a while in silence, holding Jessie's hand. "When was it, Nun? What does she say?" "Last December." Anne started to her feet, suddenly broke away from Jessie and ran toward the cottage. Her face looked happier and calmer when she returned. "I've burnt it, Jessie." "Burnt it?" "Yes, there's nothing more to hurt us, is there? It's all done with. It's just you and me now. Oh, dear lad, kiss me." End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Fox Farm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 41. Peter Venner had an old man's love for the strip of garden in front of the cottage. It consisted of 2 broad borders flanking the brick-paved path from the gate to the yew-porch, trimly edged with box and backed on either side by grass and fruit trees. In summer these 2 borders were piled high with colour, rich, riotous colour in rare contrast to the straight red path and the straight green hedges, Flowers seemed to grow much as they pleased, and there was something for most months of the year. Snowdrops, crocuses, a Daphne miserium, polyanthuses, black velvet and old gold daffodils, tulips, columbines, pansies, peonies, Solomon's seal, monkshood, roses, delphiniums, white lilies, torch flowers, Michaelmas daisies, a root or two of chrysanthemums, and a clump of Christmas roses. The borders were so crowded that you could hardly see a square inch of soil, and yet everything flourished in a way that would have made a professional painter of herbaceous borders look down his nose with envy. Old Venner was pottering up and down the brick path, stooping now and again to pull up a weed and throw it into the long grass at the back of the borders. The prevailing colours were the massed blues and whites of delphiniums and Madonna lilies, though a few oriental poppies struck notes of discord where the rose bushes nearer the cottage were smothered in bloom. The slanting of the evening sunlight upon the borders webbed them in a net of gold. A few bees were still at work, their humming being the only sound to break the silence. The old man looked round the valley, up at the summer woods with their domes gleaming against the west, and along the grassland, rich and deep where the stream went lazily. Leaning over the white gate, Peter Venner could see the woodyard spread out below him with its brown faggots, its sheds with their mossy thatch, its banks of nettles, sheep's parsley and ragged robin. The lodges and piles of poles threw sharp black shadows. Even the most neglected corners were wild and beautiful, awash with the green foam of summer. Peter pulled out his big silver watch. "They ought to have topped the hill." As he stood and listened, a slow and expectant smile spread itself over his face. He heard the sound of a horse trotting, the hills above giving back a faint echo. It was the lazy slipshod trotting of an old horse, and some minutes passed before Peter could catch the grinding of the wheels upon the road. "That's old Johnson's horse, sure." The cart turned from the main road into the lane, the horse's hoofs making a dull plodding sound on the softer surface. The crown of a man's hat came into view, followed by his brown and bearded face, but Peter's eyes were watching for red roses in a black straw hat, and for a girl's face that was looking up radiantly toward the garden and the cottage. Old Venner went down the sloping path and met Anne halfway between the lane and the garden gate. She flushed quickly on seeing him, and her eyes had the slightest glimmer of shyness. Peter put his hands upon her shoulders and kissed her. "Well, well, it's all right, isn't it?" "Yes, Uncle Venner." "That's a good girl, bless me. But I've been lonely. Fancy, old Venner lonely. Oh, I have, sure." "Have you?" "I oughtn't to have told you so, though, ought I? You'll go and put more roses in your hat." Anne went back to Jessie, who was carrying a light tin box by one handle. The path up the bank always puzzled Falconer, though Peter had fixed up posts and a handrail. Jessie could never be sure of striking the place where the path began, and more than once he had walked into the ditch. Anne took him by the hand and led him up the bank. Their faces caught the evening sunlight as they passed through the gate into the garden. Jessie felt Anne's fingers tighten on his. "Just stop a moment, lad." She was looking at the banks of flowers, the green lines of box edging, the straight red path, the clipped yews and the long, low cottage with its blinking easements and warm roof. A thin column of blue smoke rose against the background of the wooded hill. Nothing could have been more clean and peaceful than this cottage and these flowers. "It's just perfect, Jessie." Old Venner caught the words as he reappeared from somewhere with a bunch of roses. "What's that? What's that, Nan?" "I was saying it's just perfect, Uncle Peter." His old face wrinkled itself into one broad smile.
He had noticed that Anne was unconsciously feeling something upon the third finger of her left hand.
Well, you've seen it in winter. That's the test of a place such as this. Jessie, my man, I'm glad to have you back.
I'm glad to be back.
Ah, you're a lucky man.
I am. Anne laughed softly, and Jessie's arm went round her while old Venner disappeared between the yews into the cottage. Isn't it queer how things happen, Jessie? I don't want to boast, lad, but I believe I've broken your bad luck. It wasn't all bad luck, Nan. I was a bit of a fool. No, Jessie, but things do seem to come true sometimes when one wants them very badly. Yes. The great mistake in life is to give up wanting anything. End of chapter 41. End of Fox Farm by Warwick Deeping.